If that shuttle with the blonde Aryan
Hangman
hurtled into the sun, I would not have given a shit. This episode of Draft Zero is brought to you by ScriptUp. They are industry expert story and script consultants who don't promise that access to industry bullshit. They just want to make your script better. And they do that by giving you a really great detailed report and, importantly, sit down with a scheduled call with you to talk through the problems. That's where the magic is. So obviously, if you want more Draft Zero more often, become a Patreon. But in the meantime, thank ScriptUp. And if you want to use their services, use promo code DZ10.
Hi, I'm Stu Willis.
And I'm Chaz Fisher.
And I'm Mel Killingsworth.
And welcome to Draft Zero, a podcast where three emerging filmmakers try to work out what makes great screenplays work.
In this episode, we are tackling stakes as expressed through biopics. So,
just to be clear, stakes, S-T-A-K-E-S.
Yes.
But Draft Zero strictly on how do you write food porn.
And we'll just read through your scripts now.
Excellent.
So, I mean, look, the main reason we are doing these two different topics and conflating them is A, because Patreons asked separately for an episode on stakes and for an episode on biopics, and also because I have written a couple of biopics, and one of the things that I really struggle with is stakes, particularly biopics where the audience is aware of the outcome. To that end, we are looking at Hidden Figures, Downfall, and Bright Star. Those are the movies we're analyzing. The idea is that if we look at films where audience knows the outcome, it means that the filmmakers are relying on different things to keep the audiences engaged. We've taken away, I guess, the mystery or the answer to any plot-driven or external questions.
Yeah, and look, you hear that kind of bandied around also in the context of prequels, and at a certain point we considered actually doing a Star Wars prequel, possibly even Obi-Wan, as like, well, there's no stakes, we know that he lives.
And Leia lives, and Luke lives, and Uncle Owen lives,
yeah,
and Aunt Beru lives.
Right, yes.
Sorry.
But, you know, given the right historical lens, depending on what the film was a biopic, at a certain point everyone dies, right? So,
Yes.
But there was a comment from Bitter Script Reader, a former guest. If you haven't listened to our episode on what makes Michael Bay so fucking great, you should listen to it with Better Script Reader. He made the observation, which I agree with, which is knowing the outcome doesn't necessarily remove the stakes from the stories, because otherwise films wouldn't hold up to rewatches. If you rewatch a film, which most people do, not every film gets rewatched, but we often rewatch films, and we certainly do in terms of this podcast. If they are still working, then knowing the outcome doesn't change the quality of the craft. And I want to say that because I'm coming to say that maybe relying on the audience not knowing the outcome just makes you lazy, right? And that with biopics, you just have to work a little bit harder in terms of how you think about the stakes and how you construct the story in order to give your audience a emotional experience, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the key, is that emotional experience, right? Like, we don't rewatch Goodfellas because we want to know, and I'll really get into this in Bright Star, but we rewatch it to feel the panic, you know, when the helicopter is circling overhead, to feel the mania, to feel that tension, to have an emotional experience. So yeah, I think that the stakes aren't necessarily plot or outcome driven. The stakes are emotionally and character driven. That's not a binary. That's saying more than the other.
100%. But I came into this, as I do with all our episodes, with a pretty fixed point of view, which is, all right, like the plot outcome is known, so they're going to compensate with different kinds of stakes, be they like internal character stakes or perhaps, you know, more thematic or philosophical stakes. But after watching Bright Star, I'm not entirely sure stakes is as necessary to making a good film as I had previously thought. And I think I was so fixed on this because I've read a lot of my friends' scripts, and there's one friend in particular who every time I read one of their scripts, I'm like, I have no idea what happens if the characters don't get what they want. And I'm like, they could just stop the story, they could stop going after what they want, and they would be perfectly fine. And I think that's true of some of these movies.
The question is, why are even stakes are important, right?
Yes.
So, okay, let's start with what is the question, is what is stakes? So let's unpack that a little bit before we return to why stakes are important.
To me, the clearest way I can put it is, what will the characters lose? What are they risking, but what will they lose if they fail?
And fail at what? Because it means that in order to have stakes, they're wagering something, which means they're going after something, right? So they're wagering something. And I would say it's not just about what they lose, but it's also about what they gain. None of these films, you're quite right, are plot driven. And I don't think that knowing the outcome means you don't have plot stakes. But these three films have chosen, and I think it is correct to say that they have chosen to focus them largely not around the plot. They're not about the chain of cause and effect. I'm less well-versed in biopics as a genre than perhaps you are, Chaz. Can you think of what you would see as a plot-heavy biopic?
Chaz's favourite, American Hustle, although calling that a biopic is possibly stretching the point, given how much it deviated from the true events. But I think there are a lot of biopics where they've specifically selected moments in history that perhaps the majority of people are not aware of. And there they can do more using dramatic irony and mystery and external stakes, because the audience might have no fucking clue what happened in, God, was it The Last Duel? What was that Ridley Scott movie? I think, Stu, you knew the outcome of that because you're a sword fetishist. But these three films we've specifically picked, we know in Hidden Figures that the US wins the space race, right? We know in Downfall that the Nazis lose and Berlin falls.
Oh, spoilers.
In Bright Star, that Keats dies. Well, not all of us know, but I guess romantic poet enthusiasts.
I mean, my partner is a former English teacher, now writes English curriculum. Did not know that Keats dies that young. Yeah, she watched it. She was absolutely in tears in the end.
Of course, I was in tears and I knew how it ended every time.
Which shows you that knowing the outcome doesn't necessarily change how you feel about things.
No, but also, like, here's the thing with stakes. You can set the stakes and the person can simply fail to reach the stakes and then have the consequences, right? That's a valid execution of setting your stakes.
The stakes of the individual then, rather than the world or the plot, as it were.
I mean, I'm just drawing a broader conclusion here that's going to be important. I think all of these films, it's playing with the audience's understanding of the events, right? All of these three films are consciously aware that some of the audience will know broadly what's happened. And what it's actually they're interested in exploring is the impact of living through, for lack of better terms, historical events. In the case of Downfall, it's very clear, like even the tagline is a city waiting for its downfall, right? It's about living, it's not just about the death of Hitler, and it may be centered on that, but spoilers, he dies at the end of the second act, which is a great second act turning point, right? For those characters, he is the lowest point. It's about living in the impact of history on those people in there. Bright Star is about the impact of living with someone who's going to be considered one of the greatest romantic poets, right? The characters are not aware of this, but the audience is aware of this, and I think the filmmaking is aware of this. I don't think The Last Duel at all is playing with your understanding of French judicial combat, right? Only sword nerds like me have a vague understanding of that, right? That there was certain kind of rule sets. So coming back to, what do we mean by stakes? And why stakes are important is when I talk about this in terms of fiction, I think stakes are important, particularly for like quote unquote plot heavy films, because stakes help you create character motivation. Okay. That we, in kind of something that ratchets up the tension, right? A classic kind of action film, like, I don't know, Edge of Tomorrow, right? You need to increase the stakes constantly, because if you put obstacles in front of the characters that get too hard, the characters will just leave they'll quit the story, right? So you need to put stakes in there and put more and more on the line for them so they push through the obstacles. So I think sometimes stories that have got issues of character motivation actually have issues around character stakes. What is interesting about all these films, I said it doesn't matter that the audience is aware. I take that back. It means we've talked a lot about emotion being related to narrative point of view. One of the earliest podcasts is on the relationship of, we know more than the characters. We've got a sympathy for them if we know less than the characters. We've got curiosity. If we've got equal knowledge, we have empathy with these characters, right? So these films all of them have to navigate that some of the audience will be aware what has happened, some won't. But it means that at some point, that is what allows you to rewatch them. That the stakes are not important in terms of the audience's emotional contact. I think stakes are important because they help us understand character motivation. And if we understand character motivation and we're not questioning it, then we can be in a position of empathy or sympathy with the character. So that's going to be my larger thesis about how these films use stakes and how they think about stakes. Is that too abstract?
No, well, just to double down on it, my one single takeaway from Bright Star, to bury the lead, fed back through my watches of the other films as well and my experience of them, is the tool that these three particular films use. And I think it's a larger writing device for an issue where the plot external stakes are well known, is that the audience is in a position of like dramatic irony. The audience always knows more than the characters, pretty much.
In terms of the world.
Yes, in terms of the world. Not necessarily in terms of each other, that's true. But these films work really hard to always keep you in a character's point of view.
Yes.
Like really, really hard. Other than the cold open in Hidden Figures, none of them use shifting timelines. They very rarely move the audience behind the characters. They always try to keep us in that moment with the characters because the whole point of them is to try and keep us experiencing what those characters are experiencing, because that's what's keeping us, what kept me riveted in these three films.
Emotionally engaged. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not relying on mystery. I think there's probably some small elements where they've got a bit of mystery and then it plays it as a reveal. Hidden Figures with Catherine, for example, you don't get to see her domestic life and the fact that she lives at home with her mother and has 3 children and is a widower until like 15 minutes into the film. We introduced her into the work sphere and then we meet her in the domestic sphere, but I don't think it's played as mystery. It's played as a reveal, but it's not actively making you lean forward with the question of what are they doing.
But that's interesting as well because you've already met her. Like, you know that she has at least likely, because she's the one that we see in the cold open, right? And I have really interesting thoughts about this cold open, which you asked me a question about why the cold open. And as I was rereading the script, and I was like, producer notes, you don't need it. But as I'm rereading the script, I'm actually realizing how much setup that cold open does. And that cold open actually sets up that moment with her and her mother and her kids in really interesting ways. Subtle, but it's there, which is really interesting to me. That you're right, it is played as not a mystery reveal, but the thematic elements of it have been laid literally from the moment the film opens.
And I would also say that it chooses for us to experience that moment as she experiences it. I've come home from an exhausting day of not being respected and having my intelligence belittled, and I come home and I have now to shoulder this additional emotional load that is my life.
I know, actually think it's proper emotional labor. It's not just emotional work, it's emotional labor. It's that she is managing her emotions and the emotions of her family, right?
What's the difference between labor and work, Stu?
I will put a link to the conversation that actually talks about the important difference between emotional work and emotional labor.
Thank you, Stu, for educating me. But we seem to have segued somewhat seamlessly into Hidden Figures.
No, because I do want to lay a little bit more pipe.
Oh, God damn it.
Right? We're just teasing towards it, but I think it's important pipe because there are different types of stakes and we're kind of using different terminology. And I'm happy for us to use different terminology because we've got different understanding of stakes. But I've been thinking about it in the context of doing this episode. It's been really useful for me because there's this video from Michael Arndt, which is great. We talked about it in the previous episode, Insanely Great Endings. And Michael Arndt talks about how he sees there as being 3 different types of stakes: internal stakes, external stakes, and what he calls philosophical stakes, right? External is what we've been kind of calling plot events. So it's the Death Star is going to destroy Yavin 4, right? And then he's got internal stakes is kind of like emotional stuff. And the philosophical stakes for him is the competing value systems within a story. But I'm going to break down that further because I'm like, I think these can be more useful. Like there are better, for me, more categories that I actually think are useful in terms of thinking about these stories and how these stories in particular work. So this is me going to break them down. And they overlap. I'm not saying Michael Arndt's wrong. I'm just using terminology, which for me is more precise. I think there is world stakes. What is at risk outside of the character's immediate sphere? So what is at risk for people they don't know? or in the larger world, okay, I think is an important one. Then there is what I call relationship stakes, and that is what it is at risk with characters and other characters in their sphere. You could probably break that down and say there are different types. There's like emotional stakes, and there's the relationship itself is at stake, but often it's about this character and what's at stake to be risked or lost. Because I think Downfall is all about the relationship stakes. What does Hitler think of me is kind of a lot of what that film is about. And then there's personal stakes, which is what is at risk with the character. And that can be, the classic kind of life, death risk, but also kind of physical or emotional injury, right? Is the kind of personal stakes of the character. And often it's hard to dramatize personal stakes as in create it in externalized reality. So we're actually often tell like what we've been calling internal stakes, I actually think is relationship stakes most of the time. Will my son love me is about our relationship, right? It's not about me. It's about my relationship. Maybe I end up having some psychological injury as a consequence of that. But what's at stake isn't necessarily my self-esteem. I think there is two other types of stakes that are then go beyond this. I think there's worldview stakes, which is what Arndt was kind of calling philosophical stakes, or what I've heard is called as moral stakes. And I think moral stakes, they're kind of talking about a more traditional understanding of moral, meaning, I guess, psychological. But for me, worldview stakes are about what worldview is going to prevail. And that worldview can be personal. It can be built into the larger kind of relationships of the kind of worldview of the family unit or a community. And there is the larger worldview of the society at large. And I think the last set of stakes that I think is useful for me understanding is the audience's relationship with the character. How does the audience feel like at the character? It's actually not something that is staked by the characters. It's actually something that is staked by the audience, right? Your relationship with the film and with the characters. So how do I feel about this character is something that is staked. Most of the time it's going to be like, well, I'm rewarded. They've won. My stake is a win. I'm putting something at risk. But there are some films which very deliberately the audience stake is you no longer liking the character by the end of it. Or that you take a character that you think is despicable, like Hitler, and the film does a very good job of making you have these moments of like, I kind of feel sad, but I don't. Like, I'm not saying that I think he's a good person or anything like that, but it's complicating your relationship with them, which is why the film is being complex.
Yeah, I was about to ask you for an example, and yes, Downfall is the perfect example of what you're talking about.
Which is why this is filmed so great. But I think there are other types of films that are not biopics, right? Because what we're hoping to do with Stakes is by using biopics as a lens, we don't just help you write better biopics, Jazz, we help those of us who don't write biopics to write better, right? And I think films like House of Cards, Fleabag, Fight Club, films where the narrator speaks directly to the audience, do have audience stakes. Right. The whole point of House Card and Fleabag is they're despicable characters who speak to the audience because they want you to like them. Fleabag is a horrible person. She's horrible to everyone in her life. She talks to you in order for you to understand where she's coming from.
I'm just so fascinated that a guy who's literally commits murder and is very openly racist, etc., is like on the same level as somebody who makes fun of her date's teeth. Like, I'm not saying you're wrong, because you are 100% right.
She takes her sister's jacket.
Like, those were your two peak comparisons.
Okay, but they're despicable within it's all relative to the world.
You're not wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I was very interested that those were your polls.
I mean, and Fight Club. Oh, absolutely. And I do that deliberately, that comparison. It's not the first time I've made that comparison, right? Fleabag is nowhere near at the scale of Frances Underwood, right? But within her world, she is as kind of horrible as, she is that outlier. Anyway, so that's world stakes, relationship stakes, personal stakes, worldview stakes, and the audience's stake in the film.
But we're all coming back, and I'm going to just keep repeating this because I only have one point to make in this entire podcast, is empathy.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a film or a story without external stakes or mystery or something like that, you are going to have to work extra hard and perhaps use additional tools to create empathy with your characters.
I will agree. Bright Star doesn't really have world stakes, except for the audience's knowledge of what is at stake, right? But certainly Downfall has world stakes, and Hidden Figures have world stakes as set up by the story and is experienced by the characters, right? They have to succeed before Russia gets, I'm helping a segue into Hidden Figures. They have to get a man on the moon before Russia does because they need the banner of freedom up there, right?
But we know it happens.
It doesn't matter.
The levels of stakes are still somewhat different, right? And I think the script does a really good job of setting up the Hidden Figure stakes. However, With Hitler, the stakes are pretty clear, right? Like genocide versus not genocide. With Hidden Figures, it's a little bit different because, yes, the stakes are big, right? The Cold War, but the actual like ripple effect is still a little bit less known, right? Like if Russia gets to the moon first, what does that change within history? Like that's an arguable thing. So the stakes are a little bit more muddled and middling, right? And then with Bright Star, they're not world stakes other than, you know, the complete influence of all English written language since whatever. But they are three different levels of stakes.
For characters to wager something and the audience to wager something, it has to be something that we value. For the audience, what we're wagering whenever we watch something is this worth my time? Why have I spent, 2.5 hours watching Downfall?
You spent an hour and a half.
I was joking about that. But it has to be valuable to the character, right? For them to understand the win or the loss. And I think their understanding of the world has to be something that they can risk or lose. So I disagree that there is no external stakes in any of these films. Bright Star is the closest because we don't see much of the outside world. Downfall, the external stakes, is the civilians. It's very clearly, the film is a great pains to show you that the decisions being made by all those people in the bunker is having very real consequences on those people. And what you've been talking about, the worldview stakes in terms of like the genocide, is what the audience is bringing.
Yes.
In knowledge. But that doesn't mean, like, we know that Luke defeats the Death Star. That doesn't mean when we know that and rewatch it, it no longer has external stakes. I think that's a spurious way of thinking about it, because it means that every film loses stakes as soon as you rewatch it. And that's just bullshit.
I think every film loses mystery when you rewatch it.
But not in the way you experience it in real time. The mystery beats in Knives Out still work. They may feel slightly different, or slightly coloured, but they still get you to lean forward and lean back. The manipulation is still very potent when the filmmaking is very good.
100%. And I agree with you to an extent. The one qualifying thing I want to make here is, first of all, it's a very different experience to go in and see a movie for the first time when you know the plot outcome. Like, all those decisions that those characters are making is tainted by our experience as an audience in Downfall or Hidden Figures or Bright Star by knowing the outcome, right? So which we've already acknowledged. But the important thing for those stakes is not, like, we're not watching those movies to get the sense, these movies in particular, to get the sense of satisfaction of, will they destroy the Death Star? None of these movies, it's the sense of satisfaction, even in Hidden Figures, is not, will they do the math right? That is not the satisfaction of this movie. All those world stakes are important in these movies, but they're only important in as much as they relate to the character journeys.
The characters. And I absolutely agree with that. And that is actually my point.
You can't steal my fucking point.
We're agreeing. We're actually agreeing, because what you are saying, we're coming at and using different terminology, right? But what I'm saying is, because if it's spurious to think about what it is, it's about what the characters value, right? And if the characters value something and they feel it is at risk, the audience will feel it is at risk, even if we know it as the outcome. As you say, it puts us more in a position of empathy because we're no longer intellectually engaging the movie. And I kind of agree with you. Oh God, I kind of agree with you. Let's just pretend I didn't say that. I agree with you that films on a rewatch will take on a different flavor, that we often deepen in our understanding of character, which isn't even that what Scorsese said, that what you remember about great movies is the characters and not the plots. But really he's saying that because when you rewatch them, because you know the plot, you get to go deeper and deeper in character, right? That your knowledge allows you to engage with character. But there are films that exist and works that exist in the pop cultural consciousness, like Romeo and Juliet, that I don't think I've ever knew of. I always knew that they died at the end. Okay. So I don't say that that film lacks stakes, but because the characters believe it. And I think that's where we should go into it, because I think it is important in Hidden Figures. They do an absolutely great job. Those characters believe what they're doing is important. They believe its value and they believe it's at risk and they act like it. Better Call Saul is a fantastic prequel, and I'm terrified for Gus, even though I know they're going to live, because those characters absolutely commit to the reality, and the writers make sure that those characters commit. They don't have plot armor, right? In fiction, we call it plot armor. None of those characters act as if they have plot armor. And none of the characters in this film act like they have plot armor. Obi-Wan Kenobi acts like he has plot armor. And he's written like he has plot armor. Like the whole secreting him into the base.
In the TV show, you should clarify.
Yeah.
Why would you do that unless you know you're invincible?
Right? In terms of how he behaves, unless you know invincible, you wouldn't do it exactly like how he does it, as far as I'm concerned. And people can disagree with me with them. And then if they want to disagree with me, sign up to the Patreon and tell me I'm wrong. Now we can transition to Hidden Figures. It's been half an hour, so.
Equilateral, trapezoid, isosceles, tetrahedron.
I've never seen a mind like the one your daughter has. You have to see what she becomes.
Come on! Move like that.
Catherine, we all gonna end up unemployed riding around in this pile of junk.
You're welcome to walk the 16 miles. Or sit in the back of the bus.
You kiss me up.
You have identification on?
We're just on our way to work at NASA, sir.
I had no idea they hired.
There are quite a few women working in the space program.
Well, given, Mel, you as an American are acutely aware, or more aware than Stu and I are, of the space disasters. You commented that you knew that this wouldn't end in death.
Okay, do you want to summarize the film first?
Well, I was actually going to ask Mel, as the American aware of the outcome of the film, to summarize it for us.
Okay, cool. Let's do that then.
It's actually quite hard for me to adjudicate, right? As an American, I went and saw this movie in theaters immediately when it first came out, and I didn't think about it. I just knew, of course, it ended well. And it wasn't until I started talking I was in Australia when it came out. I saw it in Australia. And it was that I realized, as an American, I have so absorbed our big space failures and space disasters so that I knew, this movie isn't one of them, therefore it ends well, right? I didn't know the specifics. However, I did know of the three, I knew of one of the three women who had done this computing. And part of that is because this movie does this really interesting thing where it makes it about their space success, but it also makes it about their social success. And that it sets essentially two sets of stakes. To summarize the film, you've got three women, all black women, who are computers, mathematicians who work for NASA, human computers, which is where the term comes from. They do all of the computing of the math. They're working for NASA during the Cold War, during the space race. And the idea is that whoever manages to conquer space, to get to the moon first, to succeed in the first, manned flight that lands on an extraterrestrial planet, is going to quote unquote win the war. And so then the movie follows them mostly through a few months worth of time as they are already working at NASA when we meet them, but we're following them as they work specifically on a couple of different shuttle launches and a couple of different builds towards launching men into space and onto the moon. And so that is the film in total. You're following that, but you're also following their personal journeys.
So we've got Catherine, who is the most gifted mathematician of the three of them, who ends up working for, what was it called? The Space Task Force or something like that. Anyway, the main group responsible for figuring out how to do this. Then we've also got...
we've got Mary,
who's working for the engineering team. And then is it Dorothy? Dorothy, who is also a very gifted mathematician, but has taken on a supervisor role in the colored computing group, kind of a more maternal figure. And they each, like this film out of the three films is the most conventional. Like all these three women go on very paralleled, very clearly structured journeys from outlining what their want is, outlining what the obstacles to that want is, and how much they have to persevere and what they have to go through in order to achieve it.
And this is the one that this is a script writing podcast, right? And this was the script that I read. And what I find interesting, obviously, if you look at the casting, and they're all phenomenal actresses, and they all bring a very different energy to their characters, and you get that out of casting. But if you read it, it's there on the page. They are three very distinctly different energies, even on the page, which is something that I think you probably need to do in a biopic like this, right? If you're setting up three, the posters show it, the tagline, it is about three parallel characters. you need to distinguish them from each other right at the outset, and you need to do it not just in their job, which the script does, and their energy, which the casting does, but like how they're written on the page. And the page really actually gets that across. It gets it across in the big text. It gets it across in how their dialogue is written. It gets it across even in the, particularly Catherine, in the wordless sequences, the way that she's written. I think it does a really good job. You're right that it's very conventional in terms of its structure, in terms of its execution, in terms of the parallel journeys they go on, in terms of the stakes. It's a very conventional biopic, but the way that it goes about it is clear on the page.
So what would you, as I'm assuming that Chaz watches biopics like in the same way he watches romantic comedies with great relish and a lot. What makes this conventional, Chaz? What are the beats that the kind of conventions of a biopic?
Okay, so, I mean, it's a lot about the overall journey of a lot of biopics are a character, and in this case it's 3 characters, knowing better than everyone else something, and no one else in the world believing them, and them having to persevere against great odds and use a variety of different tactics in order to change the world to accept their ideas or views or whatever that is.
Great summary, Chaz. Yeah. I mean, they're kind of like the steadfast arc, right? Which is the way I talk about change in a story is if a character wants something and they can't get it, then something needs to change in order for them to get it, right? Otherwise, they just keep banging their head at the door. And that can work for a certain kinds of story, which is just about like the slow descent into madness of doing the same thing again and again and failing. But it's either they change or the world changes. In the case of Hidden Figures, it's the world changing to accommodate these characters, right? They take action to change the world, and in some ways exploring the how these characters go about change. And it's very clever. And you've talked about this in your excellent Letterboxd review, Mel, about how it makes sure the backdrop of living in segregated Virginia impacts these characters, right? And it's very clear placing this within the larger kind of civil rights struggle. I mean, in some ways it's basically saying, oh, the quiet way to change the world. You could be critical of the film, but it's showing that there's multiple ways to change the world. And these women were just as responsible for changing the world as those that were marching in the streets. They were doing it in a different way.
And they have 3 different approaches. They broadly agree. They broadly have the same aims. They broadly have the same job. But even when it comes to how they engage with civil rights, when it comes to how they engage with the cop, when it comes to how they engage with authority within NASA, they actually do still take slightly different approaches. And that's certainly subliminal to the rest of the film. It's not a major point, but it is a point within the writing.
I think, and also how they engage within their own community.
It's funny you say that word. This is my thesis. The opening scene of Hidden Figures, what it really does that's interesting is that it sets up that the secondary theme of this, in fact, potentially the primary theme of the whole film, is actually community, which is really interesting to me, particularly because of the idea of civil rights, okay? So if you allow me to go on this, because we'll talk about theme again when we get particularly to Downfall, but also to Bright Star. Like, theme is important in biopic the same way that it is in any story. So when Stu asked about why the cold open, I kind of half sarcastically said, because the producer decided that we needed to like see a cute young girl to be like, girls in space and cute and whatever, and this is stakes. However, as I was going back through the script and reading it, I realized that one of the things that cold open actually does is it lays the basis for the fact that the reason that these women were able to succeed, because you've got some antagonists, you've got multiple antagonists really, you've also got an ally / white savior figure, depending on the scene, in Al, who's played by Kevin Costner.
He can save me any day.
But what enables all of these women to do what they do isn't just that they're geniuses, which they are, and isn't just that they fight ridiculously hard and that they're smart and that they leverage what they have and that they know how to do and they find it's the fact that they have community. And the opening scene, they're like, your daughter is a genius. She's gotten this scholarship. So they establish how smart she is and she sees the geometry in the windows. But the key to that scene is not necessarily that. It's the fact that they hand her parents an envelope of money and say, we all got together and raised this money to enable her to go to school.
We took up a collection amongst the teachers and such. It's not a lot, but it's enough to help get you settled in.
That's more than kind, Miss Sumner.
We did this. The community has decided that we are going to help boost this member because of her abilities to the next level. And that continues throughout the film. It's why we have scenes set at a church and a church picnic. It's why we see them with their families. It's actually why it's so crucial that they commute to work together and that the other two wait for Catherine her first day, even though they have to wait outside for hours so that she doesn't have to catch the bus home. It's why it's important that Catherine's mom, who again we see in the opening, is taking care of her children.
The plot story of Dorothy is she realizes that the computers are going to be replaced by digital computers.
Yep.
And learns Fortran, right? And then she learns it and she goes to her colleagues and says, and I'm getting emotional thinking about it. We need to, if we want to be relevant.
Your work colleagues are community.
Yeah, a community, but it's not competitive, which for me as an Australian, seeing Americans not be competitive is very weird.
Which is why for me as well, like there's that scene where Catherine gets kicked out of the public library.
We don't want any trouble in here.
Oh, I'm not here for any trouble, ma'am.
What are you here for?
A book.
You have books in the colored section?
It doesn't have what I'm looking for.
Well, that's just the way it is.
And the cop, and look, it's horrific, it's social violence, it's terrible, but at the same time, it actually it's put on the same level of emotional impact of her colleagues, because that is her work community, making a second coffee pot because they don't want to touch the coffee pot she touches, right? That is also a form. And that's why the change that happens within her community, whether it's the coffee pot thing being rolled back or the bathroom sign being taken down, the movie explores how community either disables or enables social progress. And that's your micro community, which is these three women, and a slightly broader community, which is their families, and slightly bigger again, which is their church, their NASA community, their neighbors. And that, I realized as I reread this script, it clicks a lot of things into place. That's what the opening scene really sets up, is the underlying theme of all of this is community.
Because I would say, coming back to the moral, what I was calling the worldview stakes, right? It's segregation versus community, right? Segregation is anti-community in a way. It's breaking people apart, breaking bonds. It's got the irony that it bonds these women together and they stand up to it. But the film is at pains at showing that NASA is better the more diverse it is, right? Like it's that whole, I don't understand how the Russians can beat us, as he's ignoring the smartest person in the room, who happens to be a woman, right? And it's got these subtle digs about the banner of freedom. Well, they're doing NASA in a segregated state that refuses to acknowledge what the Supreme Court has said, right? So I'd say the stakes there, the worldview stakes, are community versus kind of segregation and isolation. What is not put at stake is their family life. In another film, you could have imagined that the women working really hard, particularly in 1961, when the film is set, working really hard at jobs would be a source of conflict in their lives, would be the husband's not supporting them, would be the judgment being passed that there is if you keep on working, you'll lose the family, and that will become a story. And they've chosen not to do that. In fact, they're very supportive. Jim Johnson, who will end up becoming Catherine's husband, incredibly supportive of her working, right?
I mean, in fact, the opposite, because that's his journey. Is to go from seeing a woman's role in terms of that derogatory phrasing that he uses at the picnic to then recognizing his need to service her.
But I think the journey for him is very quick. To use a term I learned
100%.
today, not learned, but sunk with today. The velocity of that change is very quick, right? Whereas Mary Jackson's husband, that's his journey over the whole of the film, is that he's like, I don't understand why you need to become an engineer. Don't go to the court. We need to stand up with Martin Luther King and be more aggressive, right? And he learns that there is another way to win. But I'd seen that the relationships are not put at stake. Those characters go on journeys, absolutely. Right. And you could phrase them as dramatic or character questions. Will Jim Johnson realize how genius Catherine is, right? But there's nothing at stake in that dramatic question. I don't think Jim Johnson is going to be like, you need to choose between NASA and me, right? It's never phrased like that, which is great. I think that's I think that's a very empowering thing. They've chosen that to not put that at stake because it services the theme.
They've so strongly established these three characters that if they tried to do it, it would feel false. You know that her friends wouldn't for a moment let her go down that path because they've established the three of them so clearly by that point, which I think is a really good, it's a film that has clearly established not just their stakes, but also their characters. So that if they were to try to do that bait and switch with stakes, I think the audience would realize that rings really false.
I was worried that's what they were going to do when Catherine came home and we met the kids for the first time. It was going to be the battle between work and school.
Because a lot of lesser biopics would. Yeah.
I like what you've observed in terms of what they aren't putting at stake, because another thing that and this is going to reveal perhaps my white privilege, in that their jobs very rarely feel at stake. And that might be because them as characters, being Black women, working for NASA as part of the space program, they just couldn't. That wasn't an option for them to act in any way that put their jobs at stake. But I mean, I don't know for you guys, but the most powerful moment in the film is Catherine's outburst over being confronted over taking breaks.
That bathroom outburst.
Where the hell have you been? Everywhere I look, you're not where I need you to be. It's not my imagination. Now, where the hell do you go every day?
To the bathroom, sir.
The bathroom. To the damn bathroom. For 40 minutes a day? What are you doing there? We're T-minus zero here. I put a lot of faith in you.
There's no bathroom for me here.
What do you mean there's no bathroom for you here?
There is no bathroom. There are no colored bathrooms in this building or any building outside the West Campus, which is half a mile away. Did you know that? I have to walk to Timbuktu just to relieve myself. And I can't use one of the handy bikes. Picture that, Mr. Harrison. My uniform, skirt below my knees, my heels, and a simple string of pearls. Well, I don't own pearls. Lord knows you don't pay colors enough to afford pearls. And I work like a dog, day and night, living off of coffee from a pot none of you want to touch.
It's interesting to me that is the most powerful point in the film, and it feels like it's almost quite close to the middle. It's not late in the film, because to me, what these different character journeys had as stakes was not their job or not, because they were likely going to keep their jobs. It's, will they be respected for who they are as human beings?
Will they remain hidden figures? I'm not making a joke.
It was just that you put on a trailer voice to say it. You are correct.
Yeah, but that's what I meant about there didn't seem to be that many external stakes. What kept me engaged is not about these women's commitment to winning the space race. That's not why I was watching it. Because if the world stakes and achieving the world stakes was the main drive for the characters, then that would have been less satisfying. To me, the main drive for these characters was being respected, to the point where the actual climax of the film is Catherine having a door slammed in her face. Like a literal door. It wasn't even a metaphorical door. After being used, they couldn't trust the IBM computer's computations, so they got her to do it. That was the big, rom-com running to save the relationship. NASA ran to her. She did the figures. She had to run to the control room where everything was happening, and she hands over her figures, and they literally slam the door in her face. And they hold in that moment. And then Kevin Costner opens the door for her.
But Chaz, why did they have to run to her again?
For the space race.
World stakes.
But I don't give a shit at that point. I do not give a shit.
Yeah.
Honestly, if that shuttle with the blonde Aryan
hangman
hurtled into the sun, I would not have given a shit.
Mommy and Daddy are agreeing really hard again.
Like, I do not give a shit. I give a shit about whether that door gets opened.
I feel like whoever has written this film has written it for both of you, because both of you are going to approach this caring about completely different things, and it's covered both of them off perfectly.
Okay, So, Taz and I are on one level agreeing. On the other, it's a language thing, right? Like, yes, I'm invested because of her relationship with what's going on, right? I just think it's incorrect to say that there are no world stakes. I may not value them because I understand what the outcome is, but that's going to be true of every film I watch for the second time.
Sure, but you are also self-selecting there, because the only films you'll watch a second time are ones where you are actually invested in the character journey and not in the plot stakes.
I have watched Taken quite a number of times.
That's just because you really enjoy watching Liam Neeson kick ass.
Right.
That's a very different thing.
No, I just don't think you can. And maybe it may be how you watch films, but I think it's a mistake to say that they don't exist when they exist within the text.
I'm not saying that they don't exist. I'm saying that's not what is keeping me invested.
Yes, and that is an important thing. But in terms of character motivation, why do stakes exist? To motivate characters. NASA need her because of the world stakes, right? They have the romantic comedy thing because they need her to run the numbers, because the astronaut John Glenn won't fly on Mercury 7 unless Catherine double checks the numbers and he hears that it's good. Right? So there is absolutely world stakes. The whole sequence after that is about the tension of will he come back alive, right? That is world stakes.
But you just mentioned the John Glenn thing. It's also personal stakes. He has invested in her personally. It's both.
Yes. The relationship stakes to me are absolutely what drives Hidden Figures, right? It's her need to be seen as being seen by others. It's not personal stakes for her. It's not about her having physical or psychological injury. Right? It may be her sense of self-respect.
Ooh, I agree with, yep, there you go. I agree it's not about injury, but I think she has massive personal stakes. She wants to be valued as a person.
Right? That's relationships. Being valued by others is relationship-based. That's all relationships. You have to have other characters and understand the relationship with those characters and how they feel about each other for those stakes. So that's why I'm saying that their internal stakes is the wrong way to think about it. Because if it's relationship-based, you have to dramatize it by people interacting, right?
Yes, and that if she were recognized by NASA as an institution, that is also a valuable thing to her, even though that's not necessarily a person she knows. Like, she wants to be recognized by Al. She wants to be recognized by, I forget the name of the guy Jim Parsons plays. She wants to be recognized by all them, and that is a relationship thing. But she wants to be recognized by society, by NASA, by any random white dude she comes across on the street. That is a personal thing.
You're correct in the context of these movies. I think there can be internal, like fully internal stakes that get realized by someone all alone choosing to do something different, right? Like, it doesn't have to necessarily be relationship stakes, but you're totally right that that's how they're dramatizing it here.
Most of the time.
Out of interest and hoping to prove my point, which to you both are the most powerful moments of Dorothy and Mary's journeys in the movie? And I'll be very surprised if either of them are from the climax of the movie.
Wait, are we still talking about stakes here, Chaz? I thought you wanted to keep this episode focused.
I do, but this will hopefully prove a point. So each of you do one. Who wants Mary?
Mary is
the engineer.
Yeah, I love that she is always anti-authoritarian.
Not a great place for three y'all be having car trouble.
We didn't pick the place, officer. It picked us.
You being disrespectful?
No, sir.
I love that she's the one who is making the snide remarks to the cops. I love that she's the one that, in that very beginning scene when she sort of almost gets plucked out of the thing and she makes the snide remark and Catherine has to like calm her down. I just love that she never loses that streak.
Except when she's got to smoke up the judge's ass. She's extremely respectful there. She actually flips on her character role at that point because something's at stake, so she has to change.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Hampton High School is a white school, Mrs. Jackson.
Yes, Your Honor, I'm aware of that.
Virginia, still a segregated state, regardless of what the federal government says, regardless of what Supreme Court says, our law is the law.
Your Honor, if I may, I believe there are special circumstances to be considered.
What would warrant a colored woman attending a white school?
May I approach your bench, sir?
It's the influence. There's something at stake, and it's the influence of Catherine and Dorothy that have gotten her to that point. I love the scene where they get drunk and she lets loose, because it's the polar opposite of that scene that you're talking about. And it shows that not just that she understands, but that her friends enable her to when it really does count, because it's not what she does in the first scene. She still mouths off to the cop, even though there are still stakes there. But when it comes to the judge, she does the other thing because she has grown and she has changed and she has been enabled to do that by her character journey.
Yeah.
I think that whole scene is actually really uplifting because she wins. That is her winning.
So would you say the judge is the most moving part of Mary's story for you?
Yeah.
So that's about 2/3 of the way through the movie. Stu, what was the most powerful moment of Dorothy's journey?
I'm going to say it's actually the husband recognizing her, coming back to what I was saying earlier, him giving her the pencils, being proud in her and recognizing her, and her no longer being a hidden figure for him, right? Him acknowledging her fight, because the whole thing, he's been resisting her decision to go to the court. He's been kind of be the other voice on her shoulder saying we need to be more agitated, we need to take a more aggressive stance, and we don't want to fight within the system built by the oppressor. He's got a point.
Yeah.
And then she doesn't do what he wants. She goes and tries to circumvent, uses the system built by the oppressor and appeals to the humanity of the judge and wins, but it's his recognition that there's another way. That is the moment, because what's at stake for her, it's not just that I want to be the first. And that speech that she gives to the judge is super important because it's her articulating what's at stake for her, right? And what's important, not just for her, but for everyone else around her, for the community. So I guess in terms of the worldview, it's representing the worldview stakes. But on a personal level, maybe the reason we were disagreeing over relationship stakes is that there could be a more atomic word for personal, that there is like these stakes related to specifically just the singular individual. But the relationship with her husband is where I teed up. In terms of, and it's very similar because it connects to the theme. I would say, I mentioned earlier that the scene with Dorothy and Kirsten Dunst's character, kind of classic white.
Vivian?
Yeah, Vivian, right? It's a great scene, but I wouldn't say that is the scene that released emotion.
New assignment came down the pike.
Always changing around here. It's hard to keep up.
Seems like they're gonna need a permanent team to feed that IBM.
How big of a team?
30 to start.
Thank you for the information, Mrs. Mitchell.
You're quite welcome, Mrs. Vaughn.
It would possibly be either when she's like, come on girls, we're going to go and become programmers, right? Like she has enabled her community to win, and there is a recognition of her ability and she's able to bring with her, right? Like that is lining up the film. But she's taking, in terms of you say that their careers aren't at risk, I don't think necessarily their work at NASA is at risk, but I certainly think that what they're doing very early, the film is very clear that the people that work for Kevin Costner don't last very long, only last a couple of days. It puts that on the line.
Yeah.
Very early on, we have a scene where they literally have a whole discussion around the fact that the computers are eventually Dorothy's motivation. Stakes motivate character. And if there wasn't their jobs at stake as computers, Dorothy wouldn't have picked up the book on how to program, right? So to say that their jobs weren't at stake, maybe that you didn't believe that, but the characters do, right? The characters believe that either they're temporary, they know they're serving at the grace or the mercy of their oppressor, right? So they know that they've got that, and then they may no longer be there. Right. And so that motivates them.
My broad point is, yes, their careers are quote unquote unstake, but that is not what the film is making an issue of. And the fact that both of you, the three of us, have pointed at our three most powerful moments, all being actually around the middle to the just after the midpoint, and none of them are to do with the resolution of the world or the plot stakes at all.
If you, and I did this earlier today, if you Google or YouTube, you type Hidden Figures space, the next thing that comes up in it's bathroom scene. That is what is the top search scene from this whole thing, is that going off about the bathroom, which is a very personal stakes.
Yeah, which, I mean, I love that bathroom scene. But what these women are risking for is respect.
Exactly. And you've pointed out the climax with Catherine, who is our main character, It's an ensemble film with his 3 other characters. But as you say, and you point out, Mary and Dorothy have stopped. They're largely uninvolved in the climax of the film. They are literally passive observers of what is going on. Mary, is like mouthing what they should be doing, and they cut to NASA to show what they need to do to save John Glenn, right? To show that she has the knowledge and she'll be valued, but she's not there changing things. Catherine is involved because NASA needs her and needs her to verify the numbers, and her numbers to do with the calculation of the landing site are also at risk. So her numbers need to be good for John Glenn to land safely. And she gets to be in the control room. So yes, it is about her respect, but that respect is literally in the control room of NASA. And they invented that scene. She never went into it, right? So in real life, they've added that because it's the way of connecting the world stakes to her relationship stakes with everyone else. So she wins the respect. And it's only after that.
Can we take one more detour, which is biopic related, which my other one was? So you're talking about them inventing that scene, right? And then we talked a minute ago about the scene where she gets her shoe stuck in the grate, and it's very comedic and it's very full on. How much do you think in biopics does the audience allow for that sort of thing to be constructed to give them, okay, sure, this exact thing didn't happen, but it's giving us the feeling that these characters had in real life, and so we allow it? And how much do you think the writers, when they're constructing the script, play on that? Not necessarily take advantage of it, but all of these biopics have those moments.
So the writers are going to great lengths to connect the stakes to the world because their journeys were over. They'd actually won already.
One of the reasons I get frustrated with biopics as opposed to kind of historical reenactments is because often they're what people think is the truth. So I think there's an ethical thing there that kind of can rub me the wrong way. From what I understand, and one of my friend of the podcast, Tom, is literally a PhD in World War II German history, right? And he's like, nope, Downfall is pretty accurate. To all the historical sources that we've got is fairly accurate. The one kind of question is Albert Speer. They've maybe been influenced by Albert Speer's books where he's kind of changing the record about himself, but it's probably the most accurate, followed by Bright Star, and then quite further down is Hidden Figures.
Which is fascinating because I think that Downfall plays as something that is not. And the thing about Downfall is that this is a biopic explicitly about theme and worldview and morals and not actually about historical accuracy at all. So it's fascinating to me to hear that it is obscenely historically accurate.
Yeah, it's about as I mentioned earlier, this idea that there is an audience question, which is a thematic question, which is what is the impact of history on these people living through historical times? Why make a biopic, right? Why not do something that is, if you're focusing on an individual, right, you're doing that as opposed to Dunkirk. Dunkirk isn't a biopic as far as I'm concerned.
Dunkirk is a setting.
Yeah, but it's still an historical event, but they haven't chosen to focus on a particular individual, right? Hidden Figures is the story of these women that were literally hidden figures, and what is the reason to understand that is what is broadly at stake is these women no longer remaining hidden, right? That is kind of what is at stake at the audience, coming to understand that they made valuable contributions, that they are then recognized by others. And I think this film has stakes on multiple levels. Chaz is saying the world stakes don't connect into the film. I think that is true of most films. The reason that we care about Luke stopping the Death Star is it's about to blow at Yavin 4 with all his friends. Most disaster movies, ID4, they have most disaster movies have a kid or a failed marriage or both, or some friend on Earth. They cut back to that
dog.
The dog. Oh, Earth's about to get to blown. Cut up to the fucking dog in front of the TV, whimpering, and you're like, oh, you're going to stop it before the dog dies, right? Because you make it world-based and it just becomes abstract, right? Which is, how 50 million people can die in World War II, right? Because numbers start, or, COVID.
Well, one person's a tragedy, a million people is a statistic.
So world stakes are often connected to relationship stakes. And I think Chaz has done a good job, as much as we're disagreeing, of pointing out that, you don't care about the world stakes, but I just don't think it's about us knowing the outcome, right? The world stakes motivate the characters so we understand what they're feeling, but we care about them because we want to see how their relationships are changed.
Yeah. I'm focusing on it because I'm trying to answer the question, what keeps me engaged? What tools keep me engaged when I'm watching a film where I know the plot outcome? That's the main question that I'm trying to answer. And world stakes is not the answer for me.
And so I think it's going to be really interesting for you to answer this. I really want to hear it, because then if we can take these lessons and apply them to films that are not biopics, that's when we get something interesting, right? How do you make a film that stands up to rewatching? And then what you may realize is that mystery is a cheap trick. Right? Dramatic irony has a lot of power, which Tarantino realized. A lot of his greatest scenes, actually, we know the outcomes, except obviously when he surprises us with the outcomes.
I mean, Inglourious Bastards and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Yeah, he changes history, like the power of cinema to be revisionist, right? They both play differently, but no. But on a scene level, dramatic irony is a powerful tool. But I think there's a lot in stakes. Just to focus, particularly Catherine, I mean, as much, there's kind of two key relationships in terms of how Catherine is navigating her world. Right? There is Al Harrison, who's the director of the Space Task Group, who's the one who's brought her in and she's been warned about. And the other key character is Paul Stafford, who is another kind of aggregate character played by Jim Parsons, right? And he's the one that is definitely like upset that A, she's a woman, B, that she's black. And so it's looking at what's at stake in those relationships, but it's particularly the Jim Harrison one. Will she win him over? Will she not? That is definitely at stake, and the way that other people perceive her. And it's almost a dramatic question. Will she be recognized? The fact that when she writes her name on a report, Jim Parsons gets hers to cross it out, but later he lets her leave it on. We know that there's been a value change, but it's also what's at stake is her visibility. So it's got all those relationship stakes, but absolutely got worldview stakes. But I also think it's got audience stakes. How do we feel about these characters? How does our relationship feel about these characters? Or more importantly, what does this mean? Right. And I have to say, I didn't know whether or not Mercury, which comes just to wrap this all up, I didn't know whether Mercury 6-7 was a success or not. I was like, maybe they've actually picked an American space disaster that I hadn't heard of. And he does die. And I actually felt that stress. And yes, maybe I won't feel the same stress the second time I watch it, right? Because I know, okay, yeah, cool. John Glenn, Glenn Powell lives and he will look exactly the same and turn into the Hangman, right? He's basically an immortal vampire that's a test pilot for the US Navy, right? That's going to be my mental headcanon. It's got a lot of stakes. I agree with you. It's all about positioning us in with empathy because we understand what is of value to these characters and we are aligned to them in terms of empathy. And I guess what you're saying, it prioritizes the relationships more than it does the events and the world. And that's what makes it rewatchable. And maybe the films that we go, this is rewatchable, are about the character relationships as opposed to just trying to see if they defeat the big bad.
Yeah, it's not necessarily character relationships. It's just that they're doing something else. And these films in particular all do something else.
Like, before we move on to the next film, we have a word from our sponsor. When it's time to write, you need to be able to focus on the words and nothing else. Arc Studio understands how screenwriters think. They've created screenwriting software for the 21st century, one that doesn't distract with an overloaded interface. Say goodbye to archaic, outdated screenwriting software and hello to advanced story-building features, industry-standard automatic formatting, and stress-free collaboration that is easy to use as Google Docs. Arc Studio is already used by beginners and professionals alike, such as the team behind the Netflix show Arcane and by David Wayne, writer-director of Wet Hot American Summer and Role Models. Join the thousands of screenwriters who have already made the leap. Arc Studio offers a completely free plan, but you can also get $30 off the pro plan if you visit the link in our show notes or draft-0.com/ArcStudio. So, again, if you want $30 off the pro plan, check out the link in our show notes.
But now that we've squashed spectacularly 2 segues, Stu, would you like to summarize Downfall?
Oh, man. But I should... Okay, let me look up the synopsis.
You watched it 90 minutes ago.
All right.
Das ist ja Artillerie.
Es ist alles verloren. Im Norden steht der Russe kurz vor der Weidendamer Brücke. Im Osten am Lustgarten, im Westen im Tiergarten. 300 bis 400 Meter vor der Reichskanzlei.
Ich werde niemals kapitulieren. Eher jage ich mir eine Kugel durch den Kopf.
Ich führe alltäglichen Sinn für die Realitäten verloren.
Ich flehe Sie an, verlassen Sie Berlin.
Wir können ihn doch nicht alle einfach so allein lassen.
Mit dem, was den Führer erwartet, braucht er niemanden.
Aber der Herr Goebbels und seine Frau bleiben doch da. Die Kinder ja auch.
I think what's interesting coming into Downfall is I expected for it to be kind of really cleaving heavily to Hitler's point of view. Okay. I almost thought it was going to be like a chamber piece in the bunker. That was my somewhat cultural awareness of the film. I had not seen it before, but it is not that. Though what is interesting about it and John Keats is both of them use the historical figure as kind of their anchor. And I'm really interested in this idea that we'll kind of talk about. I'm going to steal your line. You know, John Keats is like the love shark, right? Using the Jaws shark. That these characters that are kind of these like gravity wells or black holes. Like they bend the reality of the story around. They make the story happen. I don't know if they're the protagonist or the antagonist, but it kind of feels that there's something else. And Downfall is that. Because basically it's depicting the final days of Adolf Hitler. But what's interesting about it is it's got a large ensemble. It's told from the point of view of a young woman, Trottel. I'm going to fuck up a lot of the German names. Trottel is her secretary, and she's our primary point of view character into the operations within the bunker. Then we get a lot of access to various of the senior command as they are fighting the final days of the Battle of Berlin. The first act is largely everyone but Hitler has come to the conclusion that Berlin is lost and they need to flee. And depending on who you are, they may need to get the civilians out of there. The end of the first act is Hitler realizing that, yes, Berlin is lost. The second act of the film is actually kind of him waxing and waning on that, but ultimately coming the decision to end his life. And then the end of the second act is actually him killing himself. It's the lowest point for all the characters around him. And it's the consequences of that for all the characters that we've been following, which includes some civilians. We cut to a Hitler Youth, but there's basically multiple point of view characters because the film is really interested in the downfall of the overall world and kind of the impact of this gravity well, this kind of like Nazi shark on everyone around them. I think I've explained that largely poorly because I think, as you say, plot-wise, there's not a lot going on, right? It's just the Germans getting closer and the Russians getting closer and closer and closer. And they fucked up Berlin, if you know anything about World War II history, right? And they were a serious threat. Like they were brutal. There's a reason that the German officers are like, we need to run to the Yanks. They're going to be a lot more welcoming.
Yeah, and this film does not pull its punches when it comes to that either. The Russians are vicious, but the German officers are vicious in advance of the Russians being vicious, which is, if the title and the rating and everything don't do it for you, could not be enough trigger warnings for this film.
Yeah. What Stu has touched on, but I think undersold in this film is just how many characters there are in terms of not just like characters on screen, but how many of them actually get point of view moments, right? And so because this film successfully services like 20 characters, I would say, where you get into their point of view and it makes you empathize with their experience, which is a deeply uncomfortable thing when you know historically who a lot of these...
Empathize, not sympathize. I think it's very good at that.
Yes. But even then, I'm like, I don't want to feel sorry for this person who orchestrated...
I don't. I understand them a little bit better, but God, I don't feel sorry for them. I mean, the children... Obviously, you feel like, I think that that's really key. But you're right. Like even the children, there's at least 10 of them that feature.
That's definitely audience stakes.
Yeah. And so because of the film servicing all those different characters, there really isn't like a central dramatic question.
Mm-mm.
Yeah.
Or if there is a central dramatic question, it's answered, right? We know Berlin is going to fall.
It's a theme. It's the banality of evil.
I think in the structure of the film, the first act question is will Hitler believe that Berlin is lost? Right? And the answer is yes. And then in the second act, it's one of those, like, there's a midpoint where it changes, but it's like, will Hitler accept surrender? And the answer is no. He commits suicide. And what's cool is the film, like some films that do that really great second act low point, is suddenly you feel as unmoored as all the characters. I thought the film was going to end when Hitler died, right? Or largely the fact that it's got like close to like 40 minutes.
It goes for like 45 minutes.
Yeah, and it's suddenly like you feel as lost of these characters of like, what the fuck now, right? That is the dramatic question. What the fuck now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you're right, Stu. But I'm not saying that there's not broader dramatic questions. I'm just saying the film doesn't seem to pose, like, there's not a big one that's driving the whole film from like a quote unquote inciting incident through to the end. And that's possibly because there's a lack of a single point of view character. And I don't mean this as criticism.
No.
But there's a lot of dramatic, like micro dramatic questions. There are some of these characters who literally appear for the first time in the film around halfway through. And I'm just going to use one particular example. You've got this doctor character who appears and gets a private audience with Hitler, and he asks Hitler's permission to leave Berlin. And Hitler says no. Now, you've only just met this person, and then Hitler thanks him. Hitler says, I will take responsibility for all the research that you did on the Jews, right? So you suddenly learn that this doctor was one of the people using Jews for medical research as fucking guinea pigs. And then the very next scene is that doctor having dressed up in his military best. All his kids and his wife are dressed up around the dinner table, and they're having the best food that they can in cut-off, war-torn, bombed Berlin. And he has grenades under the table, and he, smiles lovingly at his family and then blows them all up. And there's just so many. That one's the shortest one that I can identify as literally 2 scenes where you meet a character, enter their POV, and then see the consequences of it. But largely that is kind of happening for all 20 other characters throughout this film. It's putting you very much in their point of view and then forcing you to, as you say, Mel, empathize with their position and then see how that plays out.
Remind you of their atrocities, but never showing you, particularly with the senior command, what they've actually committed, which I think is possibly what is troubling for some people, right? I think the way we feel about characters when they talk about things they've done versus seeing them do it makes us feel differently. And I think that's important because largely our point of view character is Traudel, the secretary, right? She bookends the film, and she bookends the film as an old woman, right? So the film opens coldly, right? Similar to Hidden Figures, that it's got a cold open of video footage of a woman telling this time how she was like, I wasn't really interested in Nazi stuff, but the boss offered me a job. And it goes from her video footage, which may be reconstructed, but we're assuming it's real at this point. Because the question is, why have they done that? They could have chosen to use the fact that we're going to tell the story about the downfall of Hitler, and the plot stakes, for lack of a better word, is we don't know who lives or dies of all the people around him unless you're like some fucking Reddit freak. Either she existed or not, it doesn't matter. She's the point of view character. They've deliberately done that because I think the thematic question, the question that is running throughout the film, and it's related to worldview stakes, but I think the thematic question is, will the Germans, when they've lost, not just recognize that they've lost, but recognize the atrocities that they've committed? And that is only answered when we see her at the very end. Because everyone else is willing to accept that they've lost. Almost none of them except her, actually none of them except her, accept that Germany was in the wrong. They've just accepted that of defeat.
It's actually a miracle of narrative structure. I think it does so much heavy lifting in micro plotting. Like almost every scene poses a question that is usually answered either within the scene or by the next scene, and it keeps you engaged from moment to moment like that. There's a lot of dramatic questions. This is actually a very plot heavy.
But on the micro, it's kind of a little bit like The Exterminating Angel, if you remember our thematic sequences episode, where it's like there's actually no, like, I mean, I've said that there's kind of dramatic questions, but I don't think there's plot questions. They're not this trying to solve this problem, right? Constantly, as you say, it's very micro. Like,
I mean, the fact that you're comparing it to a Brunel film seems to say that the philosophy is within the text.
It is definitely philosophizing.
I just don't think it's stakes. I don't think it's competing worldviews.
Isn't that stakes? Isn't that philosophical stakes? Because one of the scenes that to me best espouses what this film is actually about is near the end, when there's the last remaining soldiers that we're following, the people who are trying to actually break out of the Russian ring of the city, and they're trying to live. That's what they're trying to do. Hitler is already dead. They all know that Hitler is dead. And the leader of the army has already surrendered, has ordered them to stop fighting, but they are still, some of them, committed to, National Socialism and the Third Reich. When news comes down to them that the war is officially over, half the room shoots themselves. And that to me is kind of the dramatization of what this film is about, because the theme is, and the stakes are in the title, it's not just about the downfall of Berlin, it's about the downfall of this ideology, right? And not to say that it has fallen down and it hasn't, survived in different ways. White supremacy is alive and well. That's not what I'm saying. But the point is that when these people had nothing more to fight for, some of them chose to shoot themselves, is kind of what's at stake for every single character in this film. Every single character in this film gets asked at some point, what is it that you're committed to as a philosophy, as a worldview? And some of them are committed to Hitler as a person. Some of them are committed to Nazi socialism and the extermination of Jews. Some of them are committed to the Third Reich and German nationalism. And the fact that the power of this film, the fact that they decided, like you said, Stu, this film is set when they no longer have control over the Holocaust. So they are no longer in a position to commit any further atrocities other than to just not care about the people of Berlin by continuing the war, which, some of them do have that question posed of them in the film and in select scenes. But it is about, that what are they committed to philosophically?
I think the film is making us ask those questions. I don't think it's what's at stake. For the characters and what motivates the characters, it's actually less about whether they live or die. For Hitler, it's whether his legacy lives or dies, and largely their worldview, right? They want the continuation of it. And, Hitler choosing to get his body burned is because he doesn't want to be, particularly, as the film points out, that they kind of emerged in opposition to communism. They absolutely hated the communists, right? And if you know the history, you'll know that. But the film makes enough references to I was fighting Reds from the beginning and, I'm sure as shit, that's Goebbels. But for them, what is at stake is not their lives. It's actually their ideology for the characters. And that's for those characters that are motivated from that particular thing. So in some ways, the stakes about this is about revealing who is motivated by what. Right. And it could be that the character of the secretary is motivated purely by survival. She's the one that is able to survive and kind of puts her own self-interest above everyone else. But it's also her self-interest allows her to compartmentalize. And as much as then she denies at the end having any knowledge of the Holocaust. And there's very much a scene in the middle of the film where she is transcribing Hitler's notes and he's basically saying how proud he is of the final solution. She kind of looks at him and keeps on typing. So the film is saying very early on that she was aware that what she was doing, but it was just her job. And later on, we see her kind of in denial about it, right? So she is a survivalist. So we're looking at the stakes are about survival. What is the cost of survival and what do we want to survive, right? So I think for all these characters, the stakes are very high, right? And it's also about their relationships. And for a lot of the characters, it's about what does the Fuhrer think of me? And what power he has over them, and also what they think of him. What is at stake is his legacy and him beginning to realize that he's losing control and that he no longer has the power. People are disobeying his orders because they no longer follow him, right? And so what is at stake is his power.
Yeah, there are multiple scenes that are just around 8 people in a room and Hitler's going fucking batshit, like with the meme scene we've also. And the question is, are they going to allow him to continue to do this? Like, he is unhinged. He is making horrible strategic choices. He has no fucking idea what he's doing. And the fact is that in probably 7 out of the 8 scenes, they just do. And the fact that the script can staggers all of those narrative questions out to continue asking it and then to continue saying, yep, they're still doing it, is really, that's the structure. It continues to question or push at those stakes, whether you say that they're personal or world or whatever, and continues to say, yep, all right, well, they're still here. And then go on to those minor personal things where Chaz is talking about how every scene re-asks a question.
Where I would agree with you, Mel, is that what the film's trying to do, right, very clearly trying to do, is put you in empathy with these people, put you in a position of making you feel what it must have been like in being in that bunker, making those decisions, having these pressures on you.
I don't think I quite said that, but I'll accept it.
You said empathy, not sympathy. That, I think, leads to the discomfort that you get placed in by empathizing with these monsters, makes you acknowledge their humanity.
Sure. And by humanity, accepting that those stakes and how that happened is, if you accept all of that, means you accept it can happen again.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because, right, if bringing it back around to the theme, that's the point of a biopic. Really broadly, it's to dramatize something that has already happened. But you start boiling that down, and again, slightly more broadly, but philosophically, it's to understand humans better. It's to understand our world better. It's to understand, through understanding history, to understand a potential future, whether for better or for worse. Like, that is the biopic. Cue angelic noise here.
I just don't know whether I'd frame it as it's at stake. Something that I'm just trying to be very precise about what we mean by stakes. And maybe frame it as, what does this mean? The audience is wagering their time, then maybe what the audience is at stake is the audience going, why am I watching a biopic that's trying to make me empathize with one of the evil people? Why are you doing that? And the answer is because you need to understand that we look the other way all the fucking time. It's very easy to pretend these people are monsters and that you wouldn't do these things. But when you're in that moment, as the film so very cleverly does, right, its use of narrative point of view is brilliant, right? It both uses the fact that we largely know that Berlin is going to fall. Like, if that's your knowledge of history, you may not know that Hitler killed himself. You may not know that he was burned. You may know that most of his senior officers were killed or died in communist camps or at Nuremberg or whatever. You know that Berlin fell.
You know the Nazis lost.
And it uses that dramatic irony to play it as a tragedy. So you feel sorry for these characters. And then yet it intercuts his extremely personal point of view of what's in the bunker with what's going in the outside of the world. So they're talking about the civilians in the abstract, and we see what the impact of the civilians is. So it's placing you in a very complicated emotional position with what's going on, right? So you're with these characters, but also going like, that's how horrible is that?
I would disagree that you feel sorry for them.
No, I felt sorry for lots of the characters at different moments and then hated myself for it.
I think you feel sorry for a few of them, but I think that saying that you feel sorry for even most of them is pretty broad.
No, but like even in that moment where that doctor who experimented on Jews was about to blow up his own children, I felt sorry for him.
I felt sorry for the children. I could have interesting.
I do have a thing about processing dialogue. I just do think talking about it makes it sound abstract compared to having seen it, right? And I think the film uses the fact that these people don't see what happens, and that's how they're okay with it. Like, maybe sorry is not the right word. I'm in a position of empathy.
I think that there's a thing that's, speaking of dialogue, and there's a scene where there's two high-powered Nazi officials arguing, and one of them comes in and he says, the Russians are mowing down your recruits because they lack experience and weapons. And the other one replies, that is compensated for by their fervent belief in the final victory. And he's just so fucking matter-of-fact about it, and he's just so willing to sacrifice what he sees as chattel, even though in most circumstances he would hold up these chattel as the Aryan ideal. And you really get to see that philosophy just laid naked out in plain text. And I think that is the other thing that this film does really well, is just really lay that all out in dialogue, lay out how much that everyone in these situations just despised even the people that they claim to hold up as the ideal. And I think that's again, it's a really interesting use of a biopic and the way that you can use language so bluntly.
Okay, and I don't disagree with you. The fact that they're portrayed as narcissists, the fact that the film actually points out in this little thing going around saying Hitler, who wanted you to stay and fight for Berlin, he couldn't even stomach it and killed himself, right? That's how little he thought of you, right? He's clearly a narcissist, right? He's an abusive narcissist. I think the film is very clear in showing that, right? And that has a power over people that kind of like, it's not love bombing in his context, it's hero bombing. You're a hero to the people. But the next minute he talks about how he hates them, all of them, and the people that, if everyone that was great is still alive, and the reason we've lost is actually the fact that everyone that's left is weak, right? But none of that is actually to do with the stakes and what keeps us engaged. And that's what I'm interested in unpicking. The philosophical thing is really interesting. It's really interesting intellectually to think about, but moment by moment, that is not how the film works, I don't think. And that's a good pass to Chaz.
Yeah.
Maybe for me, that's how it worked.
I'm more in Stu's camp than in Mel's here, but I just wanted to make an important distinction, is that this film, interestingly, did not ever make me empathize with Hitler as a character, while it made me empathize for another 20 genocidal monsters. And I think the only moments where it shows him being kind is to create those relationship stakes. You need to understand that Eva and Frodel and Goebbels actually loved this man. and worshipped him. So you needed to believe that.
Oh, fuck. Yeah, absolutely. I agree that they do need to establish that.
To me, there's definite stakes. And I think I've made this point, but I would say the way this film keeps you connected moment to moment is that there are micro dramatic plot stakes, but you already know the outcome of them. So you broadly, right? You know Berlin Falls. So you don't really care about them. And it's all about how do those situations dramatize how these people feel in relation to their own ideology is a...
Philosophy might be the word you're looking for.
Yeah, no, but both of those words feel too kind for Nazism. Do you know what I mean? But
ideology.
Yeah. Their commitment to Nazism is what I want to say, is like every single one of these characters has their commitment to Nazism tested.
Or to the person that represents it. Like, I don't think Trudel is like a true believer in that sense, Trudel, or however the fuck you say it, right? They don't see her talking about the cause, but she's absolutely committed to the person, right? Like she volunteers to...
Yeah. But she's the bookended character that the film deliberately makes us go, are you really what you say you are? Like, the film does not pose that question of any other character that's represented.
This is extra textual, but Albert Speer is interesting because he basically perpetuated this myth. So he's the architect, right? And you have this moment of him going, well, I stopped disobeying your orders. There's documents to show I started disobeying you, right? And that's like Albert Speer started to portray him, because he survived, portraying himself as the good Nazi, right? He tried to be like, oh, there's some of us who had no idea of what was going on, and there's a lot of more recent accounts that say, that's complete bullshit, right? He fabricated that stuff. But I think he is another character that kind of has that, but that is a relationship stake. So I want to break down what stakes exist in this film. Whether or not the world stakes make you feel anything, the world stakes exist, right? And the world stakes is not will Berlin fall. It's like how much of Berlin will be left. And the civilians are part of that, right? They're not characters. They don't do things. They simply exist. But that is absolutely at stake. The longer that they delay in surrendering, the longer that Hitler fucking fucks around and decides that his magical army is going to appear, the worse that the civilians, it's going to happen to everyone else outside the bunker. And the film is at great pains to show you that. So we're engaged with that because we're just like, hurry the fuck up and like accept that you've lost. We know you've lost. We know from history that you've lost. So just hurry the fuck up and accept this, right? There is a lot of relationship stakes, and that's most of the stakes, right? There is the relationship between Hitler and everyone else with Hitler, right? That is at stake. His sense of identity and their sense of identity connected to him. And then that's related to kind of worldview. Right. I would say what's interesting, there is personal stakes with this, say like the little boy who is a fictionalized character, the little boy running around, there's personal stakes about will he live or die? But then there's personal stakes when he sees eventually that his father has been killed as a potential traitor, but it's like all his father did was not fight in the Battle of Berlin. There's no evidence that he corroborated with the Reds, right? But it's all that kind of like the damage that is being done by this ideology to this place, right? And then there's the worldview stakes for their characters, because it's quite literally their worldview under siege, right? We thought there was going to be a final victory and characters beginning to accept that their worldview is not going to be triumphant. And so it's like, I may die, but can the ideology live on? And that's why they're all writing their testaments. And then because they want their ideology to live on. And I know there's some discussion about whether these films glorify these things or not. Personally, I think we need to show these people as not monsters, because otherwise if we pretend they're monsters, we're going to pretend that it can't happen elsewhere, right? And then all it takes is that this kind of pattern of behavior, right? This kind of like abusive hero bombing kind of behavior, like it's kind of a bit Steve Jobs, right? It's just that not everyone has it's like that whole idea about not all psychopaths are into killing, right? That's just a very small subset of them. Some of them are actually very effective business people, and a lot of them are very effective in other professions. Right? But the audience sex is, why am I watching this? That's what I'm wagering, right? And how do I feel about these characters? And we're talking about the fact that it's playing with our emotions so much in terms of, as you say, sorry is not the right word, but like the fact that we sit there and watch Magda kill all 6 of her children. They could have just done that as a cut, right? Her walk in there with the cyanide pills.
Not just that. They show her, I thought she was killing them the first time.
Yeah.
She was just giving them a sleeping draught so that she could more efficiently kill them the second time. And they show her every 6 kids, I think, and they show every sleeping draught and every poisoning. And I think that is holy shit.
Yeah, it's fucking phenomenal decision, right?
I forget whether or not you bleep swearing on this podcast, but
we don't.
My God, yeah, phenomenal. And that's got to be within the script. The script has got to spell every one of those out and say you must, as an audience, face and feel this happening.
And it's absolutely empathizing with her character.
Do you mean to tell me, Mel, that I felt sorry for her as well? Like, obviously you feel sorry for her children who she's just murdered.
You feel sorry like you're a fucking idiot.
But I felt sorry for a woman who had been put in that position.
I just feel like you're a fucking idiot.
Well, that too, but...
I feel sorry for her for being so blinded by this ideology.
I think it depends a little bit on whether you read it as she knows Berlin is going to fall and either her children died this way, quote unquote, peacefully by her hand, or are murdered by the Russians. I think that's the only way that you could say...
No, there was clear ideology there.
She's very clear, I don't want my children to grow up in a world with Nazis.
Yeah, no, that's how I read it. She didn't want them raised in that way. I felt nothing but loathing for her.
Oh, yes.
But I don't have children. And I think that, who knows, maybe that does complicate how you read that and who you empathize with in that situation.
The choice to show that moment, as you said, to actually script and then shoot.
Which is a script choice, yeah.
Every single one of her children's deaths made me constantly, for each one, go, what has happened to this woman that this feels like the correct choice for her?
It made me think, the way that, and I'm going to deal with mostly Western society, but partly because that's who this is and whatever, and that partly because that's the majority of the media I consume. But when you look at all of these majority women who go to court because they have, for example, drowned their children because they believe the rapture is about to happen, their children are about to die, they have to do this or whatever. And they are looked at as A, delusional, and B, monsters. And that is how they're portrayed, that is how they're seen, and that is how they're judged. That is what the judicial system does. And I think that there's a really intentional parallel between them and between the way that these scenes are scripted and shot with her. And I think that is because the script is trying to portray her as delusional and a monster. And that is, whether you want to call that stakes or philosophy or, driving the emotion of the audience or whatever you want to call it, I think that's an intentional scripted choice. And I found myself just having a hard time getting a handle on this as a biopic. It is, but it's a really a unique type of depiction, even among, and I've watched biopics about wonderful people and heinous people. It's just the way that it addresses the stakes and the characters is so unusual.
It's because she doesn't value the lives of her children. So it's playing with what we value as people, right? So something that we haven't really addressed is stakes often rely on our worldviews and what we value. And it's kind of an alien worldview that for her, it's not that she is risking the lives of her children, right? She no longer values the lives of her children. They are subservient to not being corrupted by communism. Right? And so it feels alien to us. And I guess maybe Chaz and I are being technical by saying it's a position of empathy because it's placing us in real time inside the experience of the character. Doesn't mean we are aligned with her understanding, but we're with her in the moment when she does it. So empathy, I think, here is we're experiencing with, as opposed to I'm feeling the same feelings as her, right? Because I think what makes that moment so powerful is that what is at stake for her is the survival of an ideology we found abhorrent, and she no longer considers her children's lives a risk or of value. Okay. And so it's this kind of this filmmaking technique that is putting us in this really uncomfortable position. And that's what makes it powerful. But as I said, the historical, this is based on pretty solid historical records, including that of the secretary, right? So it's actually, there's very few aggregate characters. I mean, maybe the one they treat Himmler who's absolutely an abhorrent person, and suddenly he seems reasonable by offering surrender as opposed to him being like a fucking opportunist, right? Other characters saying he's an opportunist.
It's all relative.
Well,
he's being an opportunist by offering surrender at that point.
But they show him at the very opening saying, how good is it going to be when I shake Eisenhower's hand? They very clearly paint him as an opportunist.
Should I shake his hand or should I give a Nazi salute? I think is the...
Yeah, he's an opportunist, but we feel he's bad because he's an opportunist as opposed to being the head of the fucking SS, right?
I'm pretty sure that most of the people in the US who've seen war crimes are multi-million-dollar company business owners, so I find that tracks.
Yes.
Fucking Blackwater. I mean,
IBM.
Well, should we leave the Nazi shark and end with the love shark of John Keats?
Anytime we can take the opportunity to end with Ben Wishaw, I will take it.
All right.
A palate cleanser, if you will.
I had such a dream last night. I was floating above the trees, with my lips connected to those of a beautiful figure.
Whose lips? Were they my lips? Not sure he really likes me.
Mr. Keats knows he cannot like you. He has no living and no income.
He was a dreamer.
Have you got John Keats's poem book?
My sister has met the author, and she wants to read it for herself to see if he's an idiot or not.
She was a realist.
All I wear, I've sewn and designed myself.
Interim out. Poet's got to do a bit of writing.
My stitching has more merit and admirers than your two scribblings put together, and I can make money from it.
But every word he wrote inspired the rapture of first love.
A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness.
So, Bright Star.
On that note,
is the Jane Campion written and directed film that takes us from the moment where Fanny Braun, seamstress, would that be a fair thing to call her? Seamstress living in Hampstead Village outside of London, and seems to be of society, but their family have fallen on hard times to the point where they only have one servant, and Fanny seems to be earning money as well as her mother is earning money doing laundry, but they still seem to have lots of time for reading poetry and going to galas and things like this. But from Fanny's meeting of now posthumously famous romantic poet John Keats, follows their courtship through to Fanny learning of John Keats's death from tuberculosis in Italy, where he went to try and survive tuberculosis. That is my brutal summary, but that said, this film does not have overly more plot than that. I think the first half of the film does kind of have a love triangle nature to it between John Keats and John Keats's best friend, Charles Armitage Brown, and Fanny Braun, at least. Certainly, John Keats is, we've jokingly called him the love shark because it's basically how does exposure to John affect all the characters around him? Because it's predominantly Fanny and Charles, but it's also, Fanny's brothers and sisters and others around him.
Yeah, he's clearly an intoxicating character. And I don't think the film portrays Brown's affection for Keats as kind of like a sexual attraction. But it's definitely...
No, never sexual, but definitely love.
Definitely love, and a kind of selfish love, right? So he is the closest the film has to an antagonist. He wants Keats all to himself.
Why is Keats not the antagonist?
Yeah, I mean, Keats, you could argue, is the force of change, but does Fanny really change? I'm not sure. Does the world really change? Other than, I guess, posthumously, we know his poetry is published. So it's a really interesting film because what keeps you engaged is the moment-by-moment kind of relationship stakes, right? The question, I think, is, the dramatic question that drives the film is, will John Keats and Fanny Braun be allowed to be together? There is definitely that idea because there's multiple obstacles in the way. It's romance, right? It's almost a meet cute. these characters should be together. They're not allowed to be together because of social convention, because he has no income and he doesn't earn a living, right? So he's not suitable for marriage.
I have no idea why I identify so deeply with this film.
You identify with Keats. And then, look, the midpoint of the film is that changing because Keats ends up developing tuberculosis. Oh, he has a hemorrhage of the lungs. I don't think it's TB. And then the question is, will their love be recognized, or will they be allowed to be like joined together before he dies? I think Fanny Braun, I mean, everyone's hopeful. They act hopeful. And so the audience is opposing that view. But I think there is a sense of tragedy to it. Like, because Keats is convinced he's going to die, someone in the film is telling you this is how it's going to end, right? The other characters may believe it, but John Keats definitely believes he's going to die.
Let's pretend I will return in spring.
You will return. I know it.
So the whole thing is, will they allow to be married and have their love recognized by others? Again, relationship stakes.
I'm going to speak briefly about this film and leave my learnings up front because I do not love it as much as Mel does. So I'm going to shit on it slightly and then let Mel
correct you.
Yes, fair. So
it could just be because you're heartless, Chaz.
He can have sympathy with Nazis, but not with a tuberculosis-ridden poet. It's okay.
Like, this is, as is the way with romance, it's perfectly acceptable for the stakes to be love or not love. Like, oh, woe is me. They didn't marry. I'll find someone else. Right? Like, that, I get that. But this film has to work so hard to keep you in the moment to moment, because overall, there's nothing else keeping you involved. Like, this is a beautifully crafted film that did make me cry at the end, but there were also several points of me sighing very heavily throughout, particularly in the sequence before he develops tuberculosis and after his brother dies, when he has gone, like he and Charles leave, and Fanny and John are exchanging letters. And this is why he's the shark. Like, it very rarely is in his point of view separately to Fanny. So it's all about her experience of him. And suddenly she's like born up when she gets a beautiful letter. And then she's cast down into depression when he sends her a shitty letter. And I'm just checking my fucking watch. And so what kept me engaged and actually hit me in the feels was how much this film puts me in Fanny's experience. And even at the end, Charles's most powerful moment is right at the climax as well, of him declaring how he failed and betrayed John Keats.
Shall I say it? I have failed John Keats. I failed John Keats. I failed John Keats. I failed him. I failed him. I did not know until now how tightly he'd wound himself around my heart.
Anyway, over to you, Mel, for corrections.
Dear readers, how hard I was clutching my chest. So look, I think it's interesting. First of all, Stu mentioned Romeo and Juliet, right? We all know how Romeo and Juliet ends. The thing that matters is how it's executed, and the fact that it is about this young, deep, intoxicating, intense love. And what I find, so we've had these 3 different biopics that we've chosen, and one of them is really explicitly about these 3 characters and their parallel journeys and etc. And then we have one that's much more of a philosophy and trying to get you to understand this point of view of a broad number, like this massive cast who are real life people. But this one, it's really about 2 people. And I find the thesis is summed up in that scene where Keats tells Fanny, like, the point of jumping in a lake is not to swim to the shore. It's not to analyze how this works. It is to luxuriate in it. It is to feel this love. It is to experience it. And that is what this movie's script is about. I had I couldn't find a script. I found scriptments, which is not the same. I would be interested to actually read a true script, but I think that, Campion writing and directing, I think that was her goal, is to get that. It's a biopic as an experience, as a immersion.
all the poetry that they recite, and they use the poem at the end.
Oh my God.
Which is pretty much sure it's Ode to the Nightingale.
They use so many throughout this film. And that's also an interesting thing. This is the film that most of all the 3 films we've chosen, like this is the film that really relies on quoting a word. And which was really interesting to me, because like biopics, for example, when you have speeches, like if you watched Judas and the Black Messiah, right, where you have Daniel Kaluuya giving this big speech, that is so tricky because we know what Fred Hampton looks like when he speaks. We've heard and or seen speeches of Hitler, for example, right? When you're doing speeches, it's quite tricky to either recreate or wildly recontextualize. With poetry, with someone's written words being performed, it's a bit different, and I think the interpretation, the circumstances, and how you use them to set stakes, or how you use them to personify somebody that obviously none of us knew because they lived before, is different. And the script finds multiple ways to work in these poems.
My dearest lady, I'm now at a very pleasant cottage window, looking onto a beautifully hilly country, with a view of the sea. The morning is very fine. I do not know how elastic my spirit might be, what pleasure I might have in living here if the remembrance of you did not weigh so upon me. Ask yourself, my love, whether you are not very cruel to have so entrammelled me, so destroyed my freedom.
We've got a character who's literally drunk reciting poetry that had been published, and he's kind of mocking it. We do hear Keats composing it. He recites one of his poems at a Christmas feast, and what's really interesting about that is that he recites it. There's children, there's old people, and there's people who are his peers, and they all seem to accept his words very differently. Of course, we do hear it being read aloud as he's composing, and then there's 2 right at the end. The first is the one that Fanny is reading aloud, and then there's Wishaw reading a poem in full over the credits. And so this biopic really uses these words to set what I would call emotional stakes. So it's a very different approach to the other 2, which I think is really interesting.
And I will say, like, I don't know much about the Romance poets, so I did, some Wikipediaing afterwards, and apparently, according to Wikipedia, Keats is particularly famous for the immersion of his poetry, of the reader, into like experience, particularly experience of nature. And that's what this film is trying to do, right? Like there's so many shots about texture, about touch, about light, about flowers. It is almost like stereotypically art house in the way it's shot, but I will not demean it in that way because it is basically using that immersion. Like that's what keeps you watching, not story.
Well, that's the term romantics is really interesting because I think that in modern day we tend to project our meaning of the word romantic onto it, which is like a sexual and or love connection, whereas most of the romantic poets were obsessed with nature, and that is their starting point for all of their writing, and it was a romanticization of the natural beauty, whether that was of another person, but a majority of a physical and natural depiction of life. I think in that way the script really gets to that. But in terms of the stakes, the emotional stakes, the thing that this film really does, well, the first thing is that this film uses, I think, Fanny to set the stakes. It uses a secondary character to set the stakes. The other thing that I think all 3 of these films do really successfully, and I found this interesting, is it really narrows the focus. This is actually the film that covers the biggest span of time, and it's only 2 to 3 years of time. If you look at a lot of biopics, I'm trying to remember about how long it is. I think it's, I don't know, I'd have to Google it.
I think there's 2 winters. But
So most biopics are like, this is young, now they're famous, now they're romancing, now they're doing drugs, now they're fall from grace, now they're, a lot of biopics cover somebody's life. The 3 that we've chosen cover short spans of time. This is maybe 3 years. Downfall is maybe 3 months.
Downfall's like 2 days, 3 days.
Yes, but if you count the time where she becomes the secretary and like all of that, which is covered in a very short period of time, but I do count it within the span. Anyway.
I think most of Downfall happens over like a week.
Yeah, most of it.
I don't even think it's that.
But they all narrow their focus to a really sharp point, and I think that helps make them successful, as well as Hidden Figures spans it out over 3 characters and then gives you multiple allies and antagonists. Downfall spreads it out over like 20 to 30 people, and Bright Star takes, yes, it's about Keats, but it's about Fanny, and then secondarily it's about Fanny's mom, Keats's best friend, and then a couple of other characters. It's really narrow in its focus. And that's how the second way that it sets its emotional stakes.
There's clearly, I think I'm going to use this as a distinction. There's clearly a lot of stakes here, emotional stakes. Like Abby Cornish's performance when she hears of Keats's death is just unbelievably amazing.
God. I can't breathe.
Paul Schneider's when he confesses his betrayal of Keats.
Paul Schneider, low-key, the VIP of this film.
Yes.
Not low-key, he's pretty high-key.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. But in our messenger arguments that we were having as a prelude to this recording, we were distinguishing between dramatic questions and stakes. So this is the film that I was going to come in and say, this film has got bugger all stakes, like nothing fucking going on in this movie. And that's not true. It's got incredible emotional stakes. It is the one of the 3 films that actually has the least plot and the least dramatic questions or even character questions. Like basically Fanny falls in love with him.
But the stakes are Romeo and Juliet levels of stakes.
There's no Mercutio. There's no fucking Fall of Verona.
Okay, Paul Schneider, actually Mercutio, and now I want to see it, but continue.
But there's no 2 houses.
World stakes, Chaz. It sounds
it's
like
class. It's class. The houses instead are class. They can't get together because of class distinctions instead of because of who their dads are. But they are still separated by a social and arbitrary boundary.
It sounds like the issue, Chaz, is that you claim that you didn't need world stakes in the previous 2 films, but the one film where it doesn't actually have world stakes because none of the characters have much of a world is the one film that you're complaining has no stakes.
Am I agreeing with Stu again?
Yeah, I think this is painting me to actually agree with Stu.
Right. And it could be that you don't understand the character motivation. Coming back to this idea that...
Oh no, but it's so clear. She loves him. He loves her. Things are keeping them apart. And that's it from scene 1 till scene death.
How are you not moved?
I did get moved in scene death. I did not get moved very much for the preceding 90 minutes.
Interesting. Why? Tell me what has hardened your heart.
Well, first of all, I got bored a lot, and it didn't help that my wife was sitting next to me going, these people are not real people. Like, who the fuck acts like this?
How unpassionate. Given that you're the only 2 that are still in a high school romance.
I know.
How lacking in your passion was your high school romance? Chaz, I like you. Yeah, you're all right. Shall we get married? Okay. Like, is
that's not too far from the truth.
Oh, fuck. Now we've ruined our passionlessness by having children.
As the single person on this podcast, I should not be casting aspersions against my esteemed co-hosts who are, in fact, in happy partnerships. However, the fuck do you know about love,
hey,
guys?
I'm not.
This is like...
Word. Have I bagged the film yet?
All right, Stu, what's your take?
Right. I think it works. Look, I think it's a little slow, but that's because I'm a little bit drawn to plot more than I am pure sensation. Like, it is meant to be sensation, right? And it is meant to be very moment by moment, but I'm someone who needs to be a little bit more plot. right? And I acknowledge that. And Hidden Figures is very plot heavy, right? You claim there's no world stakes, but there's a lot of plot going on. Oh, she wants to go to engineering school.
Yes.
Oh, fuck, she's got to go to the court. Like, it's constant obstacle, try to work her way around it.
Incredibly structured,
very plot heavy, absolutely fits like structural templates, right? Like, I'm pretty sure there's like a call to adventure and all that fucking shit is in there, right? If you looked at it, right? It's like my Letterboxd reviews is like, you can tell Hidden Figures is produced by Pharrell Williams of the Neptunes and Nerd because it's a supremely good pop song that he's pretty much really familiar with, just enough different about it to make it feel really fresh, and it absolutely hits you in the feels, right? Hidden Figures is very popular. Downfall is interesting because it moves between it, and in the third act, it actually comes very plot heavy. Once Hitler's dead, the actual storyline becomes, there's a little bit of like unmooring, but then Trundle is like, can she escape? Will she escape? And even though we kind of know that she has escaped, we don't know what was the cost of her escape. I mean, the film kind of hints to the fact that basically the Red Army used rape as a weapon of war. But if you've got any knowledge of that, you're like, oh, fuck, like this is really dangerous for her, right? We may know that she's alive in 50 years, but we don't know what the cost is to her or the child. Very plot heavy. Bright Star, no plot. Right. Like, it's not that it's no plot. It's that the plot is so light. It's a lot less plotty than Romeo and Juliet. Romeo and Juliet is very plotty. Like, what is the goal for these characters? In the end, it's to get, like, for him, it's that he needs to earn money from his poetry, right? So he can be worthy of marrying her, and for her, it's being able to marry him. That is the plot. But we don't spend much time in his point of view about him trying to crack poems or him trying to actually break into publishing. The film doesn't even deal with what happens to his poetry posthumously because it's not interested in that. It's about the moment by moment experience. As you say, it's about being almost romantic poetry. And there is something artificial. Like, I don't think, like Anna saying these aren't real people. Like, this is based on their letters. Right? Like the actual letters that they wrote to each other. So they're actually really like Downfall. It's actually quite historically accurate, but the film is done with a high level of contrivance in terms of how it looks. The production design and costume design is exquisite.
It's a melodrama.
Yeah, it's a melodrama. It is not trying to pretend that it's a historically accurate portrayal of what it would have been like at the time. It is absolutely art directed.
It's an emotionally accurate portrayal of what it would have been like at the time is what it's aiming for.
Well, not of the time, of what it was like to be those two.
Yeah, I mean, but it's still an impact.
Yes.
Like, I like his relationships with the family. The stakes for him is that he needs her mum to kind of come around to him is at stake. His relationship with Brown is at stake.
Yes.
It is all relationships.
Yes.
There is no world stakes.
But for him, and I think this gets back a little bit and to what we were talking about, for him, yes, those are the stakes, the relationship, being able to be with Fanny, and that has multiple contexts, making a living off of his poetry. But I actually think, and I know that you're going to say that this is subtextual because we know what we know now. But I think for him, because he could see his contemporaries becoming famous, and not just becoming famous, but getting successful reviews in magazines, that's a plot point. If we say, if I were to direct my first feature next week and the reviews were to come out the month after, right? I live and die by those reviews. He's releasing poems in real time, getting feedback from his peers, from esteemed magazines. He knows he has the potential to be a acclaimed, famous, good, whatever the hell that means, artist, and is finding himself frustrated and unable to reach it. And those are world stakes for him. And he acts like they are. He knows that. And weirdly, he knows that. But you know who really knows that is fucking Paul Schneider, which is great.
Well, all the poets, like the only point when the world intrudes is when his contemporaries say, we've got to pool money to save
literally
Keats.
Gather in like in an enclave, surround him and say, we're putting money together to send you to Italy because we know that you're better at this than we are. So hopefully you survive. Go.
But here's an interesting question. My experience was, like, this film is deliberately from Fanny's point of view so that it hits you in the feels, because I think that Keats did clearly care for Fanny, but he cared just as much about poetry as he did about her, whereas she's got nothing else in her life that comes anywhere near.
Fucking disagree. Absolutely disagree. And I think the fact that the scene opens, I wish I could yell right now. I'm sorry. One of her opening forays into flirting with him, which by the way is just points out how adorably bad they both are at flirting, is that she's talking about this stitching ruched mushroom something or other collar, and she's like the first person who's managed to succeed in doing this.
I wasn't always able to stitch so well. This is the first frock in all of Woolwich or Hampstead to have a triple pleated mushroom collar.
It's the stitching is she brags about it because she's good at it, but it's also the way that she reaches out to him when his brother dies. It's the way that she provides for her family. It's what she thinks maybe would get her noticed in the world as a fashion plate. She's experimenting. She's whatever. She has her own exterior life, and that is what enables her to be his equal. And I think the film, and again, I'm assuming this is in the script because I haven't been able to read the script, but it opens on her stitching. It uses her stitching in a plot way as well as a filmic way as much as it uses his poetry, and it presents them as their two different but equal interests and how they actually start to understand each other.
Now, this might just be my very subjective experience of the film, but I felt that if you'd asked Fanny, if you gave up stitching, you could be with Keats, she would give up stitching in a heartbeat. If you asked Keats, if you gave up poetry, you could be with Fanny, he would go,
And so this also was a discussion that we were having ultra-textually beforehand, right? Which is that I feel like a lesser biopic would put the romance at odds with his writing poetry, or say that the romance was the only reason he was good at writing poetry. Like a lesser biopic would do one or the other. And so I feel like you're asking, I understand why you asked that question.
I think Chaz wants it to be more conventional for it to work for him emotionally.
No. I don't want anything. I don't want this film to be different. I'm glad that it exists purely as it is.
Okay.
I just got bored.
I might rephrase that question. I think if you asked Fanny, would you give up stitching as an active thing that you choose, that she might. But I think if you were to say, would you have taken away from you your ability, all the work that you've put in, all the things that you've made, all of the talent, that then she would say no. And that is stakes to some extent. But I feel like that was incredibly important to her, both as a creative outlet, but also, and I think that maybe you do underestimate, and maybe I over-identify, that this is, because of where she is situated in the world, one of the only ways that she can distinguish herself as a person and provide for her family, and that she really, really does value that.
Yeah. And I guess, part of my bias might be that while the film does take great care to show her love of stitching, it does not really show the world interacting with her craft, possibly because it never did, right? In the way that it does show the world interacting with Keats's poetry.
I think you're right, possibly because it never did, but it's a focus of pride for her, for sure. To be fair, that's just an example of how the world prioritizes men's quote-unquote craft over women's quote-unquote craft.
Oh, she wasn't even if she got married, she'd cease to be a legal individual in England thanks to marriage. I think what I want to clarify here is I don't think her stitching is at stake. She's not wagering her art.
No, it's not.
Right. One of the things I like about the film.
But neither's he.
He's not wagering his art either. In fact, the film shows what I like about it is that he, instead of his love as a distraction, he actually writes more poetry than he ever did because he's happy. But what I think, coming back to the world state things, and I'm just using my own definitions and you may not agree, but I don't think there's anything at the risk for the larger world if Keats, other than what we know, but within the world as presented by their characters, there's nothing at risk if Keats fails in terms of his poetry. Right?
Yeah, he could just go and be a doctor, like he was literally a trained surgeon.
Logistically, yes, but personally, I think he would have rejected that as a path, and I think that is...
Well, he did. He
right,
rejected being a doctor
But I'm saying, had he lived another 20 years, he would have continued that rejection.
The film, A, never explores that he used to be a doctor.
Yes, correct.
B, what I'm actually saying, I'm going to rephrase it again. The film never suggests or creates the possibility that if he fails or succeeds as a poet, the world in the larger world is going to be different as far as everyone in that world is concerned. This is in contrast to Hidden Figures. If she does not do the calculations correctly, Glenn Powell's character, John Glenn, dies. If Hitler comes to the recognition that Berlin is falling earlier and succeeds that they will save lives, there is nothing at risk. There is nothing gambled by his poetry. This film's only stakes are purely personal or relationship. Right? It does not even have worldview stakes. There is nothing at stake in terms of ideology. You could say maybe class.
Right, because the change of all of English literature is something that we only know because of our point of view. That is a dramatic irony that only the audience knows.
Yeah. And it doesn't motivate the characters.
Which is why I think that this is a great choice for biopics, because it's very different than the other two.
I think it's a great choice. And I draw some lessons from it, but I'm just trying to work out why, having not sat with Chaz, about why he doesn't like it. It's just not very complex. It's not a complex film in terms of stakes. It's emotionally complex
stakes, but in worldview, plot-wise, it is not at all.
Is it emotionally complex? It's emotionally powerful. I wouldn't call it emotionally complex in the slightest.
It's not emotionally complex in terms of how you feel about the characters, right? You are either with them and completely buy into them being like 18-year-old, like super obsessive, basically like, I hate you, I love you. If you're not with me, I want to kill you myself. Like, it's super way over the top. Like,
but we've talked about how Charles's relationship to both of them is complicated. It's interesting how society puts boundaries around.
He's this fascinating character. Why does he hate her so much?
Fascinating.
You know, he's a really interesting character, and I'm very every scene he's in, I'm fascinated by.
I think he has way more emotional complexity as the film portrays it than either Fanny or John Keats.
But that's the film, and you're saying you don't like the film, and like why does Fanny continue to have a loving and reciprocal relationship with her mother, even though her mother is so insistent on enforcing these arbitrary social boundaries and not allowing her to be with Keats? Like,
she understands the motivation of the character that if she's doomed if she marries Keats, and she knows that, which is why she doesn't get engaged into him until basically Keats is dying, right?
But that is complex.
Yeah, the mother is more complex than Fanny.
But Fanny's relationship with her and Fanny's understanding of her mother's point of view, etc., like that all, it adds up. You don't need every single relationship to be massively dynamically complex for the film to be massively dynamically complex.
No, but I don't think the film is massively dynamic and complex. I think it's very immersive and I think it's very powerful.
I think it is more immersive than it is complex. I think you're underestimating its complexity a little bit. It is certainly more immersive, and I think that is, in and of itself, for a biopic where we already know the end, is an achievement.
And that is fair. And this film, more than either of the other two, showed me what I was looking for, which is how can a film be engaging without stakes? Or, you know, I'm not saying there's not stakes.
Without a big plot. Totally.
Oh. Yeah. With limited dramatic questions, with only
relationship stakes.
A single. Well, no, I love relationship dramas. I don't think relationship stakes are a problem. It's just in this one, it's like, will he love me? Will he not? To me, it was the lack of complexity in their relationship.
See, but I don't think that that's it at all. I think that it's immediately clear that he will love me. Like, I don't think that's ever a question.
I'm trying to reverse engineer why Chaz found this film boring. So why was Chaz bored?
No.
Which is a fair criticism.
I'm not saying his experience is wrong. I'm saying that the conclusions he's drawing from his experience are wrong. His experience is what it is.
I'm the one who said it was not very complex in stakes other than relationship stakes, right?
But I think the relationship stakes are complex, but I agree with you that other than that, there is no complexity. There's no world stakes. There's only our dramatic irony of knowing what happened with Keats, etc. But there's personal stakes and there's relationship stakes.
And we know he almost needs to die for it to happen.
Stake through the heart.
I mean, you just compare it to other. I'm just thinking the biopic that I'm thinking about now is like Steve Jobs, which I much preferred on the rewatch. It creates stakes through the immediacy of the keynote setup. So the idea is, for those who haven't seen it, there's 3 acts. Each is the 20 minutes before a keynote speech given by Steve Jobs, right? So there's stakes from the urgency. It needs to work, and we got to get the keynote working. But it's all about his relationship stakes. It's all about Steve Jobs' relationships with everyone around him, including his daughter, rather than the question will be, will the Mac be ready to go at launch? Will the Next be ready to go at launch? Blah, 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 right? But that has got multiple levels of stakes, and it's largely about the point of view that is told from Steve Jobs' point of view, but characters coming in and out. So I think I'm in the middle, right? I find it a moving film, but I do find there's moments where it's slightly tedious, in the same way that Jane Austen can sometimes feel slightly tedious for me at points. Just is what it is.
Books or film?
Books. And my argument used to be that her prose was constructed in such a way for people that would used to luxuriate. They had a lot of time to read prose. So the books were as much about passing time as they were about being books. That's very snide and probably not true, but it felt that there was like a luxurious pace.
How do you feel about Charles Dickens, who is paid by the word?
I'd have to read Charles Dickens for me to have an opinion.
Fair enough. Continue.
But I just think, like, in terms of the audience stakes, what our relationship with the characters are, I don't think there's necessarily any key relationship stakes in terms of the character. I'm not sure it's about making me change how I feel about Fanny or John Keats, right? So there's nothing in stake there. It is literally about watching their relationship shapes and the complexity of that and experiencing for it. She's a great point of view character for this because she is the one who's actually got something to lose. John Keats doesn't really have it, like, it's from his awareness. He has no prospects. He is hopeless. So he actually has nothing to lose, only something to gain, right? And as soon as he starts to gain, as soon as his poetry starts to actually start getting a bit success, that's when he gets sick. And I don't know whether that's true, the reality of it, but that's how they've chosen to structure it. That's the midpoint of the film, basically.
It's pretty close to reality and also highly tragic.
Yeah, it's playing as a tragedy. It is a doomed romance, and the film has chosen to keep us with Fanny. They don't mention that she remarried 10 years later. The line is that she walked the moors reciting his poetry, never forget Keats. Didn't mention that, she got married and had kids.
But that was a really long period of time for the age.
Yeah, it was 6 years in grief. Yeah.
Back then. And also, she kept all of his letters until she died. I believe.
I'd still got letters that I've written in high
maybe her
school
grandchildren.
Could you imagine being her poor husband?
Well, and then seeing him get posthumously famous would probably be a bit tough.
Yeah. So, should we do final learnings? Mel, did you learn anything, given that you have a few blog posts coming out on this from watching these 3 films?
I think, I think the script structure, how to take what we've established as a fairly straightforward narrative script structure for all 3 of these, right? They all happen in chronological order. They don't play with structure. They don't really mess too much with timelines or anything like that, but how to take 3 very different characters, 3 very different approaches, but make them all successful, I think is, from a writing point of view, a really good takeaway. I think also just hearing and or arguing with both of you about the definition of stakes has helped me clarify it within my own script writing, which is interesting. Although I've never done a biopic, I've never written one. I've read and done coverage for some, but they were pretty loose. And I'm really most fascinated by, which is actually none of these 3, which is really, really obscure people's biopics and biopics that really play with, what's that one? It's American. There's 2. There's American Splendor, I think.
That is one of my favorite films.
Which is the Paul Giamatti one. I'm much more interested in those generally. So having to really sit down and examine ones that are a little bit more conventional, but I don't use that word as a slur, I think is quite revealing. And also, we talked about how one's a melodrama, one's a, world stakes, you can take a lot of the things that you learn from this and apply it to fictional writing, which I think that'll be the real test, is how I do that, because I've only really had, maybe a week to try to break these down and examine them. So what I take going forward will be interesting.
You, Stu, do you want the final word? Do you want me to go?
No, I don't necessarily want the final word. It's probably better if I don't. I mean, I've outlined how this has helped me kind of clarify, and I'm still like, terminology can be useful for me in terms of categorization, that we kind of started using relationship stakes and personal stakes interchangeably, and I kind of want to further break them down because it's a good way, not asking what's the external stakes, but what is at stake in the world, what is at stake in the community, what is at stake for them in relationships with other people, what is it in stake with their own relationship with themselves, what's at stake with their relationship with the audience is kind of interesting to me, right? I think the one thing we haven't done a good job of, even though we've been talking for near on 3 hours, for someone to wager something, for someone to risk it, they need to value it. That's something that we've talked about, right? But we haven't actually identified how any of these films have shown that the characters value these things, right? We've kind of not really broken down how it's clear that we know that the character values this, and therefore that we know that they're putting it at risk, and we know that they know that they're putting it at risk. We haven't actually talked through any of that stuff. We've kind of talked more abstractly about the function of stakes, which has been very useful, but I think there's something to be said about real, and it's kind of what I'm going to have to think about it, but I'd challenge our audience to it. If you haven't watched these films before, or if you have and you're going to rewatch them because of this podcast, try to pay attention to how they establish how we as the audience know that these things are valuable to the characters, and when we know and when they know that they're at risk.
I mean, I agree with you. I think Hidden Figures would probably be the best one to exemplify a lot of how did the characters know, but yeah.
I think Downfall is probably more interesting because it's almost, if I'm right, and then it's largely, other than the kind of life or limb stuff where we see, go outside and see people with blown off arms and legs and, oh, they got shot and all that kind of usual war shit. When you're talking about relationships, that's really interesting, and it ties to Blightstar. How do we know that they value the relationship? How do we know that I value what you think of me, right? And how do I know that? But
a lot of that, in Brightstar in particular, right, comes down to the acting, as opposed to necessarily the script writing. They're selling it. It's clear in the script, but the selling is where it really.
I think it's in the script, and I think that they heightened it, but like
it is. Well, I mean, I assume it is.
Oh, but Brown says stuff in dialogue like Keats. Keats means the world to me, basically. And he talks about like Keats loves me and all this stuff. Like it's very clear that Keats is very important to him. How Keats talks about poetry. Keats talks about how the soul of a poet and why he's into poetry, right? Like we know he really values poetry. We know the importance of, I'm kind of doing it now. We know the importance of marriage because the other characters start talking about it. You need an income. You need a live, he needs an income or he's living. Otherwise you're going to be destitute, right? All the characters talk about what's at valued. And the simple answer is that it often just comes into dialogue because people talking about what they value, right? We haven't done a podcast for fucking 10 years because we don't value storytelling, right?
Yeah, I think Downfall is, in terms of showing what they value, is the fact that those values are in every single scene. One character is basically tested, you must choose between this value or this value. Like they're just constantly forced to choose. Like the dramatization is mesmerizing. I think in Hidden Figures, where what they want externally is very different to what they want internally, it'll be interesting to see how they dramatize what they want internally. But my one, I'll say it just for posterity and because repetition is supposedly helpful for knowledge retention, is, and this actually goes to your point, Stu, it's easy for me to say, just put yourself deeply in the character's point of view, like really, really try and do that. But what you were actually talking about, that how do you demonstrate their values, that's actually connected. What tools do these films use to put yourself in the character's point of view? And part of it is just, who is your point of view character over lengths of time. But Downfall is particularly impressive, where you'll go from one scene to the next and have the exact same characters in it, but the point of view character shifts.
Oh, you'll literally watch other characters. Like, so you'll see the secretary watching someone else, right? You'll see one of the doctors look at the doctor telling Hitler how to see himself. Like it's in the literal, their point of view of what they're seeing within that environment.
Yeah. So a lot of that is cinematography as well as screenwriting.
But I think it's in the script because you can write that stuff in the script, right? It's like, and this is a great segue to plug our Mel and I's little project, right? Because I think one of the things that you can do in terms of empathy, I think real time, telling moments in real time or close to real times and dragging them out helps us connect with the character, because when it works, it becomes boring, right? But like her in Downfall kissing the 6 children, and it's like an excruciatingly holding you along. And I connected to Tarantino. But Mel and I have launched this project called Shot Zero. It's got a deliberate connection to Draft Zero because it's kind of like a little sibling. It's not a podcast. It's just an Instagram, a Twitter, and a Facebook where we kind of analyze shots, like a shot as well as multiple shots in various different ways. And one of the ones we were looking at was the use of real time in the overdose scene in Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, deliberately connecting it. It's literally the visual version of what we talked about many years ago in Draft Zero episode 16. But it's like now with shots and excerpts from the script and all that stuff. So check it out, subscribe, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Anything you want to say about that, Mel?
I think it's, we've been slowly ramping up to it for a couple months now, so it's going to be a lot of fun.
Thanks as always to all our amazing patrons who bring you more Draft Zero more often, but in particular, special thanks to our superest patrons, Alex, Bjorn, Casimir, Eduardo, Garrett, Jennifer, Jesse, Crob, Lee, Randy, and cannot leave off the amazing Sandra.
Aww.
Thanks.
If you want your name read out at the end of the film, please check out our Patreon.
I hope you all feel like arguing with either Stu or myself
about anything on this episode or anything in general.
And you can find many ways of getting in touch with us at our website at draft-zero.com.
At the website, you'll also find the show notes for this and all our other episodes,
as well as links to support us and spread the word for free via a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Very important for spreading the word.
Or if you think that what we do here is worth $1 or preferably more than $1, then you can also find links to our Patreon page to support us getting these episodes to you quicker. Thanks.
And thanks for listening.